In the mid-90s, reports began to surface that Prince, one of the world's most successful recording artists, had fallen into serious dispute with his record label. Claiming that his art had been taken hostage by merciless corporate interests, Prince announced that he was at war with the music business and that the whole industry needed to be torn down and reorganized.
I think, like most artists, they don't really investigate until it's happening to them. And I think that's pretty much what Prince found himself doing, is examining more closely. Like, well, how does this work? Prince is astute, man. He likes to read and share ideas. So the more he got into the literature about the music business, the more upset he got, you know, and how it's designed. I mean, it's systemic. That's what it does. You exploit an artist, and they get paid a mere pittance compared to what you make.
Initially interpreted by the public as an obscure contractual disagreement, the dispute proved to be the opening installment in the remaking of the music business at the close of the millennium. Fired by his fight with Warner Brothers, Prince set out to articulate new concepts in the making and selling of music, at a time when the digital age was threatening to bring the existing order to its knees.
In the 80s, Prince revolutionized music. He invented the Minneapolis sound, and he sort of brought a whole new style of music, a whole new fusion music, white and black, funk and rock, and everything into one big thing that was, you know, just Prince. That's what it was. He took the way music sounded to a whole new level. In the 90s, when his music was less revolutionary, he revolutionized the business. He revolutionized the music industry.
And time after time, what he does has vision and foresight and is ahead of its time. And it turns out that not only could he do that musically, he did it with business as well. Yet, he's not going to get the credit for that.
At the time, the significance of Prince's message was largely overlooked. His behavior was received as surreal and eccentric by a world that was yet to discern the forces of change that were gathering on the horizon. Routinely dismissed as a spoilt, clownish sideshow, Prince's profile suffered badly and his new work was increasingly ignored. But when the change arrived, it became clear that Prince had been a visionary, and he found himself restored to prominence as a leading figure in the modern landscape of art and music.
He was just out of sync at that time. His time had passed, and he had to wait for it to come around again, which it inevitably did. By the time it came around again, it's like now he's comfortable with being the legend, playing the music that he makes, not trying to be a hip-hop artist or a this or a that, and just embracing who he is and what his gifts are. And the audience was there for him to the point where he tours more successfully today than he did at his peak. So without even selling any records, he sells more tickets than he did with Purple Rain. Go figure.
He stepped out on faith by even putting out records independently and doing things like selling through the newspaper, which is why he's gotten a lot of flack from the powers that be. They don't appreciate that because then that stimulates the minds of people who are coming up. And as you see, even the younger generations now, oh, it's just academic now. This is what they do. So yes, it has helped him. And whether he gets all the credit now or, you know, 20 or 50 or 100 years from now, he will go down in history as one who did something that was revolutionary.
In the summer of 1992, Prince entered into negotiations with Warner Brothers over a new recording contract. Prince had first been signed by Warner's as a talented but raw teenager back in 1977, and over the course of his tenure at the label, his status as an artist had clearly changed. During the period of his ascent, the music industry had been drawing ever-escalating, mind-bending profits, and Prince had noted that the other stars in the business, including the marquee names at Warner's, were now being paid big money.
Madonna is one of their artists. REM has become a Warner Brothers artist. And these artists are having huge hits and signing big deals. You reach a point in the 90s where Madonna and Michael Jackson have signed very, very big deals with their record companies. $30 million, $60 million deals. And Prince is angry because Prince sees himself as a greater artist than Michael Jackson or Madonna. And arguably, he's right. Unlike Michael Jackson and Madonna, you can leave Prince by himself in the studio and he will walk out with a hit record. He's built his own studio, he is a self-contained world, he can churn out hit records. So Prince wants to be paid a lot of money.
He wanted the headline to be $100 million deal. And he became so fixated on waking up to see that headline in the newspapers that I could argue he didn't care how he got it, at least so it seemed.
$100 million reflected the general self-confidence of the music business at the turn of the decade. During the 1970s, as rock and roll matured, the appeal of black music expanded, and the public appetite for their product proved insatiable, the major labels had perceived an opportunity to generate enormous sums of money. In the 1980s, they had consolidated, and the commercial face of music changed radically. The record companies that had started life as the fiefdoms of wealthy music enthusiasts and charismatic impresarios had transfigured into enormous corporate concerns. Multinational entertainment conglomerates staffed by sharp executives with one eye on stock prices and the other on an apparently limitless torrent of revenue. Artists' profiles became ever larger, with MTV and stadium tours amplifying their cultural presence and global reach. Of the superstar acts that were made in the 80s, Prince was arguably rivaled only by Michael Jackson and Madonna in terms of fame and significance as a solo performer. He had carried that level of standing into the early 90s, and by the time that his contract fell due for renewal, Prince was once again busy at the top of the charts with 1991's Diamonds and Pearls.
By the early 90s, Prince had more or less come out of the 80s as sort of one of the biggest stars of that decade, and he'd made himself the first artist since the Beatles to hold simultaneously the #1 single, album and film position for When Doves Cry and Purple Rain. Although his sales had slightly deteriorated since that period, he'd continued to release a string of albums, you know, each more artistically questing than the last, and sort of he remained a massive, massive name sort of as the 80s came to a close. He started to slip a little bit with Graffiti Bridge, for instance, which is kind of a follow-up to Purple Rain. It was a terrible, terrible film that he made that sort of made him look like some of his artistic decisions were maybe not the best that he was making as the decade came to a close, but he also had a phenomenal success with the Batman soundtrack. So he ended the decade kind of in a weird position where on one hand, you know, some of his ideas weren't proven as successful as older ones, and on the other hand, he was still making massive selling albums. The Diamonds and Pearls album that came after Graffiti Bridge had none of the concept, you know, none of the storyline. It was just an album, a collection of songs that had 6 singles off the back of it. It was a massive seller. It sold about 6 million or something like that. And so when he entered contract negotiations with Warner's, he was actually on a bit of a high again.
Diamonds and Pearls came after some records that were not as successful commercially as his records in the 80s had been. And as an artist getting ready to go into contract renegotiation, it certainly benefited him to have a more commercial successful record, and Diamonds and Pearls gave him that right.
Though as an artist, Prince may have had few peers, from Warner's perspective, the business case was perhaps not as compelling. The label had historically been incredibly supportive of a musician who was often idiosyncratic in his work and activity, at times willfully difficult. Under the stewardship of record executives Mo Ostin and Lenny Waronker, Warner Brothers had established a reputation as one of the most artist-friendly labels in the industry. Ostin and Waronker had started out in the 1960s and retained some of the idealism of that era. Their ethos was one of allowing musicians the space to develop and express their creativity over the long term, free from commercial pressure or the demand for instant success. Prince had enjoyed the freedom to pursue the full spectrum of projects that caught his muse without oversight. The label had assented to his desire to be self-directed and to work without a producer. They had backed his forays into filmmaking, and they had agreed to invest in setting up his own label, Paisley Park Records. Although Prince had reciprocated by delivering hits and prestige, he was prone to taking unpredictable turns, including withdrawing albums prior to release, refusing to do press interviews, and on one occasion demanding that Warner's issue his work unpromoted. Decisions that struck the label as being nothing short of sabotage. When measured against the other big-name acts of the era in hard-nosed financial terms, Prince was not necessarily a safe bet.
I wouldn't have thought that Prince was, strictly speaking, as bankable as Madonna and Michael Jackson. These guys were selling phenomenal records every time they put something out, and as you can see through Prince's sales throughout the late 80s, his sales had been slipping as the decade came to an end. His albums were sort of more high concept pieces, like Lovesexy kind of confused as many people as the amount of people that bought it. He was making strange business decisions by the end of the 80s, particularly with the Lovesexy tour, to sort of tour in Europe, ignore the US market, and he did the same with Sign of the Times, not make so much money at home, go to his European fan base, whereas the other guys had a more worldwide touring, album-selling setup.
The problem they were having with Prince was that he was producing too many records too quickly, faster than their promotion and marketing machine could really digest, faster than the marketplace and the media could digest. We were in an era where most artists would release records anywhere from between 2 and 3 years apart, and he arguably could have had 2 records a year if he had wanted to. And he did want to, because he was of the mind that a record was like a newspaper. When it was finished, it was of that time. And I finished this song last night in the studio. I want people to hear it today. It's relevant to today. I produced it today. It's about how I feel today. People should hear it today. And of course, the legitimate argument was that radio wasn't prepared to accept that much product from any single artist either. And as a result, it made it difficult for the label to promote it. So there really was a legitimate argument to space things out. It just didn't fit him as an artist.
And when the parties eventually settled around a table to discuss the terms of a new deal, both had priorities that they were keen to achieve. For Prince, it was the figure stamped across the contract, $100 million to confirm him as the most valuable artist in the business. He got his wish. When negotiations concluded, statements were released to the press announcing that Prince had re-signed with Warner Brothers in the biggest deal of all time.
He and I actually had some differences about how crucial that headline really was, because when you get into the nuts and bolts of what makes a deal worth that kind of money, you know, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. There's going to be something in those negotiations, in the fine print, that you may wake up one morning and not really like once you get past the headline. And that was my argument. So I approached it pretty cautiously, because I realized he really had an astoundingly supportive, you could even say indulgent arrangement with Warner's. They were clearly losing a ton of money on Paisley Park, the label, because it was not cross-collateralized with his royalties. All the loss on Paisley Park was a write-off. Didn't come out of Prince's pocket, which is part of the reason why he didn't care and could keep turning out these kind of self-indulgent projects. Clearly, Warner's wanted to put a stop to that. But at the same time, how do you stop that? How do you do that without annoying the artist that you desperately want to keep? The artist who, as a Warner Brothers artist, is worth so much, not just in terms of sales, but in terms of the cachet. Because when you have an artist like Prince, it's attractive to signing newer artists. I mean, he's a flag waver for you as a brand name. So they were in a bind where they were looking for any means with which to cut their losses on Paisley Park, the label, without doing something that would affect their relationship with him as a creative entity. And inadvertently, he gave them that out. He gave them the means that they needed by saying, I want this $100 million deal. I'm fixated on the advances I get from my records. That's really the most important thing to me. And everything else be damned at the end of the day.
Prince came out with a deal that gave him a 20% royalty rate, and he was promised $10 million on every new album, providing that the previous album sold 5 million copies. So Prince came out of the business meeting trumpeting that he'd had this great $100 million deal that he'd just signed with Warner Brothers.
Now, as promised, those reports on popular culture. When RCA Records signed Elvis Presley back in 1956, they paid $35,000, unheard of at the time. Here's an unheard of figure for our times, $100 million. That's the deal Prince cut with Warner Brothers Records. A $10 million advance, $10 million each for 6 albums, the rest in royalties. More than Michael Jackson, more than Madonna. And Prince gets a title, Corporate Vice President.
Madonna is worth $60 million. His is worth $100 million. It's not. It's actually not. There are articles immediately at that moment in the press saying it's worth up to $100 million. I know these people working with Prince are saying it's a $100 million deal, but it's only worth $100 million if each one of his next 5 records sells 5 million copies. Now, in the 90s, that seemed possible. Today, of course it seems impossible. And even then, it seemed only possible, not probable.
Gearing up to launch a new album and a tour right now is Prince, whose upcoming LP, Diamonds and Pearls, will unveil his latest band.
Prince stopped by his label, Warner Brothers Records, last week to give staffers a sneak preview of his upcoming Diamonds and Pearls album.
I'm Diamond and this is Pearl.
Any contract where an artist guarantees that they're going to sell 5 million copies of anything is risky, to say the least. But Prince was in a very good position to do that at the time. Creatively, it's hard to say. The muse is an unreliable thing, and even though he was enormously successful, if not necessarily as innovative as he had been in the past, he'd had huge commercial success with Diamonds and Pearls, and he seemed poised to continue it.
Diamonds and Pearls had sold 5.8 million copies. 5.8, not 10, not 12, and not 6. It had sold 5.8 million copies, so he had to keep at that level. And generally speaking, you don't top yourself. A reasonable expectation is you're going to sell about 30% less. 30% less at 5.8 would be under 5 million. Therefore, he's not going to get his $100 million. And in point of fact, he's probably going to end up owing the record company money, because all that money is, well, in advance. It's a loan. And it doesn't take Prince long to realize this.
As to whether the deal worked out, which is everybody's question, it's one very simple answer. A year and a half later, he had Slave on his face.
With his new deal secured, Prince refocused his attention on music, though the terms of his agreement now set a high bar for the commercial performance of any upcoming releases. Prince had assembled a band, the New Power Generation, to whom he had given co-billing on Diamonds and Pearls, and had moved away from being a solo, electronically driven artist to working more collaboratively within a traditional group setup. Diamonds and Pearls and its accompanying tour had been enormously successful, and a follow-up record was almost complete before the ink had dried on the contract with Warner's. Keen to maintain momentum and push into the 90s with a new sound, the band worked intensively in the studio for what would become popularly known as Love Symbol, after the unpronounceable symbol that took the place of a title.
We were really, really tight after the Diamonds and Pearls tour and that album. So we were just on fire. We were, the band was just hype, ready to go in the studio, ready to record, I mean, it was just a fantastic position at that time.
It was a very positive environment with the band and with Prince. I think he was happy with the singles that were being chosen. The sound of the New Power Generation, I think, was much more commercial than what Prince was doing prior to. More organic, I think, and less electronically driven than a lot of Prince's work around that time. Maybe more in the tradition of soul music, some things, Diamonds and Pearls, and Cream was kind of, a lot of it was, there was a throwback, but there was a modern element too. But I think it's what made that period of Prince's catalog stand out is that he leaned much more on the ensemble.
I think he wanted to do something that was a little out of the box, because Diamonds and Pearls was it was commercial. It's pretty commercial, actually. I mean, it was like kind of asymmetrical, but very well done album, but it was a lot more commercial than things he had done. I think he wanted to do something else, something that was more expressive of his creative side, He always tries different styles of music, We grew up together as kids, we used to jam and play all night as kids, funky, because, I mean, we had all the great funk records at that time, So that's in his DNA. I mean, that's just something that's going to come out anyway. But I think once we had that particular that band MPG, that was just a whole nother monster. That whole band was just funky as all get out. It was just a great band.
The new power generation, just taking control. Yeah, introducing Maite.
Hello, darling. So far with me.
Tony M, Kirky J, and Damon D.
The lineup of the new power generation included a rapper, Tony M, who featured prominently on the Love Symbol album as Prince attempted to address the changes sweeping popular music during the late 80s and early 90s. The coming of hip-hop had made a major impact on black music and culture in particular. The funk and soul jams of Prince's generation were subject to a wholesale clear-out as rap became all-conquering. But by the early 90s, hip-hop itself was beginning to evolve, and the party records, political polemics and social commentaries of its formative years had given way to the aggressive, nihilistic dystopias of gangster rap, a world away from Prince's traditional frame of reference. Love Symbol made a conscious effort to address the zeitgeist, but came up short. Alongside a narrative concept and spoken word segues that confused audiences, the album's melange of funk, soul and R&B included an attempt to incorporate rap, most notably with the singles Sexy MF and My Name is Prince. Both tracks charted poorly in the US, placing at numbers 66 and 36 respectively. Coming after the recent hits from Diamonds and Pearls, it represented a drastic decline in fortunes. As for Prince's fabled $100 million, it had evaporated. Released in October 1992, Love Symbol struggled to achieve 1 million sales, far short of the minimum 5 million required to secure his advance from Warner's. The new era had got off to a shaky start.
Those singles, My Name is Prince and Sexy, were not, they were critical successes, but I think that when you establish a wide audience and then you start, you know, getting more explicit, once you're on a certain type of exploration, some people are going to be turned off, you know, but I think as an artist, you have to stay excited about what it is you're doing. And, you know, so Grandmama probably didn't buy that Love Symbol album, but that's all right. You know, somebody did.
It was a turn from being safe. He wasn't looking at the record trends and what the sales were going to be and all that. I mean, everybody wants to hit records. I'm not saying he didn't want to hit, but he wanted to do what was in his heart. He wanted to do music that was coming out of his heart. He's not going to go, I want to do Diamonds and Pearls too, the Three Ladies, or you know what I mean? It's what's, you know, coming through him.
Prince and the new power generation take control. Act 1.
Prince looked to give Love Symbol a boost by going out on his first US tour in 5 years. Commencing in March '93, Act 1 took part of the concept behind the album, a love story centered on his future wife, Maite Garcia, and reimagined it as a theatrical live performance. With a second set dedicated to the hits and the shows staged in small, intimate venues, the tour proved popular and tickets moved fast.
Oh, it was sold out every night. At that time, we were a polished and well-oiled machine at that point, so we could turn the corner, you know, and he wanted to do something a little more theatrical for the show, which was cool because it was more like a theater tour. It was groundbreaking in a lot of ways, you know.
Prince would show us the, like the reviews, and the reviews were stunning. They were incredible. Everywhere we went, it was sold out. And the band was on fire, and it was just, we just had a great time.
That's their fault. That's not our fault. I mean, you know, if their machine can't keep up with us, what are we supposed to do? What's he supposed to do? You know, he got to get his music out. I mean, within reason, if the material is good, it should be marketed, it should be put out, they should do videos for it, they should be able to go on tour, and they should be able to have support and, you know, do the things that they're supposed to do and have a successful record. Record company gets paid, they get paid.
Well, the situation with Warner Brothers, with his audience as we were on tour, I think Prince was just trying to let them in to his world to a certain degree, to let them know what he was going through. It was a monologue mostly, and them, you know, he says something about Warner Brothers, and then it's a lot of booing in the audience. And one night, I remember they started chanting like, you know, F Warner Brothers. And Prince just kind of turned around with the mic and he was kind of cracking up and looking at us like, you hear this?
He'd just get on stage and berate his record label for more or less not letting him do what he wanted, which kind of also, having just signed what he was proclaiming was a $100 million deal, didn't really chime with, you know, the poor artist who had been held back by his record label because he just boasted having this great deal where his record label were giving him everything he wanted.
Things were complicated at Warner Brothers at the time. There was a very big, I called it the Civil War happening. I worked at 2 different Warner labels during those years. There was a lot of battling going on at the top. His deal was seen as unfair or overly generous by a lot of the other artists there. And again, it comes back to ownership for him. I don't think he was ever able to accept the fact he didn't own his music. He didn't feel as loved by the label anymore, which is strange because it was the same people he had been dealing with, initially anyway, for his entire career. And once those people were gone, once Mo Ostin and Lenny Waronker stepped away and had to answer to new bosses themselves, things went from bad to worse. And he started submitting albums that were not only uncommercial, I would say in moments they were kind of unlistenable, and he was clearly not bringing his A-list material to them, and he started putting out albums so quickly that in order to get out of his contract, that I think they may have even threatened legal action because he was just putting out trying to put out an album every 6 months.
With the parties at an impasse, the argument quickly turned bitter. In the summer of '93, Prince presented Warners with a new Power Generation album, Gold Nigger. Side projects and collaborations with both protégés and other artists had been a long-standing feature of Prince's work, enabling him to make musical excursions and explore artistic concepts without the expectations attached to his core brand. But when Gold Nigger unexpectedly landed at the label, they dug in their heels and flatly refused to release it. Prince was dismayed. He responded by pressing up the album himself, distributing through a telephone order service and merchandise stalls at his shows. This foray into independence in turn provoked the ire of Warner Brothers, who dimly viewed it as a naked breach of contract.
By this point, they wanted to release a best of, sort of consolidate his career a little bit, make sure they made a lot of money out of this, you know, all of the Prince hits album sort of thing. And Prince just kept bringing them new albums and new material, and he had another side project album, Gold Nigger, which was his new Power Generation album, fronted by Tony M, the terrible rapper. This was never going to sell, but Prince wanted Warners to release it. He had success with The Time, he had success with Sheila E. and all these other side projects of the 80s, but by the early 90s the quality of work wasn't there, and so if Prince's own work isn't selling as well, they certainly weren't interested in releasing a side project that had no hope of selling at all.
I think the idea behind the Gold Nigger record was to put out an organic rap/soul record, you know, with real instruments. And also was a showcase for Tony M to do his thing. You know, it's very much in the tradition of like blaxploitation films, in a lot of it. You know, I think that we had like a deuce and a quarter on the front of the record. Like we were in California, you know, posing all thuggish, ruggish, you know, looking like we were, you know, some kind of gang. But it was kind of just a throwback thing. We had worked on these tracks, and Prince had been driving around listening to it. He was just like, I really like this. You know, let's put it out.
Those albums were fun to do because we could step out of the box and we could do a totally different sound from what Prince was doing, you know, but there were still elements of that sound that still tied it all together. And I think at that time, that sound for me was some of the funnest stuff we ever did. I thought it was funky. Yeah, and you know, these things happen, you know, and you just have to move on to the next thing, you know, and that was heartbreaking, you know, but you move on.
That was kind of in the same creative territory as another thing we worked on called The Undertaker. And I think this was also where Prince began to realize that he wasn't legally able to circumvent the system. Something happened with The Undertaker, like he wanted to just press like 1,000 copies and just give it to friends and, you know, concerned parties. And somebody at Warner Brothers said, you can't do that. And it was covers. It's like Honky Tonk Woman and, You know, there were some originals on it, but I mean, it was very cavalier. It was a jam session with me and Sonny and Prince, you know, in the middle of the night. He was like, "This is cool. Let's, you know, I want to get this out to some people." And, you know, Warner Brothers intervenes. No, you can't do that. Anything you release, you know, has got to go through us.
Feeling trapped, and that his art and identity had been taken hostage by a cynical, autocratic and self-serving corporation, Prince made one of the most drastic and infamous moves of his career. He stopped being Prince. On June the 7th, 1993, Prince announced that he had changed his name to the unpronounceable glyph from the Love Symbol album, that he would no longer turn in any new material to Warner Brothers, and that his contractual obligations would be met by releasing old songs from The Vault. His core fan base remained supportive, but the wider public were perplexed. Though his PR team loftily asked that he be called The Artist, he was more commonly referred to as the artist formerly known as Prince, and universally mocked by a media industry that was sure he had finally vacated his senses.
The artist formerly known as Prince is one of the most controversial and most mysterious figures in rock. He's even asked to be referred to only as a symbol, but for clarity in this story, we'll call him Prince.
That extraordinary moment where Prince changes his name to the symbol, a symbol that nobody knew how to print. Warner Brothers actually was on the hook to produce like little round discs full of the software to hand out to people at magazines so you could reprint Prince's name the way he wanted it printed. Crazy.
My name is very spiritual to me. It has a great deal of spiritual meaning, and one day maybe I'll hear a sound that will best give me the feeling of what it's supposed to be. But for right now, I just go by the look of it.
At that moment, his complaint is that Warner's isn't giving him ownership of his intellectual property. That's the way we would phrase it today. It becomes an intellectual property battle. I made this music, why don't I own it? Why don't I own my masters? Wait, why don't I own my publishing? All things that Prince continues to be obsessed with to this day. And yet, at that time, these were things that, you know, musicians didn't talk about that much. Now, not that unusual to find either an indie musician talking about, well, I want to stay at an indie label because I want to own my work, or to find someone, a veteran artist, saying, I'm suing my record company to get back my rights because under copyright law, and then it just becomes a lecture. But at that time, we weren't really used to artists making these complaints. It seemed like belly aching. I mean, it seemed like someone who was famous and rich complaining that he wasn't rich enough.
The name change you could look at a lot of different ways. I mean, the undeniable fact is that the name change made him kind of a buffoon. It certainly became the subject matter of talk show jokes and so on. He had to see that happen coming. I can't imagine he didn't.
That's right, the artist formerly... What do you call him? Well, you got to hold up this thing. No, seriously, what do you call him? Well, this right here. Oh, can I call him Prince? Oh, no, you have to hold up the thing because he's the artist... Hey, Paul? Oh, Lord.
The dispute and the name change were unquestionably damaging to Prince, especially the name change.
I think I'll call him Prince. All right, why don't you just get a cab and go home, all right? Check it out.
His behavior had been strange. His public behavior had been strange in a lot of ways leading up to it. And when you do something like change your name to an unpronounceable symbol, sure, it's an interesting publicity stunt, but if you're at a news organization, let alone a record company, okay, when you're talking about the artist's name, the amount of production work that goes into simply rendering that is a whole other thing, to say nothing of the public perception of what it says about that person. Now, he may have had his reasonably defensible legal and moral reasons for wanting to do that, you know, saying that, you know, Prince is a corporate entity separate from me, the actual person. My name is... it doesn't endear you to people. And I just remember a headline, I think it was from the New Musical Express at the time, and it said, my name is, and the subtitle was, and I am bonkers.
But what we like to do right now is run this little cover tune by a good friend of mine. Peace to George Michael. Peace to Aerosmith. Peace to MTV. And death to Prince.
Having proclaimed that he would no longer submit records to Warner Brothers, but yet still under contract, Prince found himself in a bind. The genesis of his argument with the label had been his prolific output, yet any new work would not now reach the public ear. Though he had picked a fight with his paymasters over releasing his work, Prince was confronted by the reality that he may have thrust his whole career into limbo.
Here was a man who, in the late 70s, negotiated not to have a producer. He had an executive producer on his first album, but he wouldn't have an actual producer on it. And that was, you know, his first battle with Warner Brothers. He'd won. His second battle was Dirty Mind, when he wanted to release a really raw, stripped-down album. Warner Brothers said that he needed to add overdubs, kind of clean it up a bit, but no, it came out as Dirty Mind, this record that Warner Brothers didn't expect. It was more new wave than R&B. Later on, 1999 comes out as a double album. It's another argument that Prince has won with them. And I think that you see a succession of Prince getting his own way, that when he enters the early 90s, he kind of assumes that, you know, he's going to still get his own way. And you can kind of see why he would, but also there's certainly a touch of hubris in what he was doing at the time. He kind of couldn't really see that the quality of work wasn't necessarily there. He was more convinced that people would just accept what he had to give them. He wasn't really questioning himself or his artistic or quality control at the time.
We were working on new music that was not intended to be released by Warner Brothers. Prince didn't want. Some material actually did come out. I mean, it all came out eventually, but at the time, we were working on a collection of songs that included stuff that was on Come, and stuff that ended up being on the Gold Experience. And for a while, we rehearsed all of it without knowing which album was coming out next, what was the sequence, how the songs were going to be separated between the two. And I don't think Prince had figured out a way yet to sidestep Warner Brothers and do it on his own. The dispute with Warner Brothers had a direct effect on our working environment, and the fact that, you know, Prince would basically be talking to somebody at Warner Brothers or his lawyer, and we'd come in for rehearsal and we'd get called up into his office, and he needed to vent. He needed to explain, you know, himself for his own sanity, I'm sure. He needed somebody to bounce these ideas off and talk to. So we'd get up there and he'd be, you know, visibly upset. And you know what Mo Austin said to me? Oh, blah, 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 blah. And we're, ooh, oh, wow, you know. And so I think his consciousness was inundated by the ongoings.
And with corporate restructuring kicking off the civil war at Warner's, Prince's former allies at the label were being steadily purged. The unsentimental, commercially focused executives who took their place had little patience for truculent outbursts from their artists and began to dismantle the empire that Prince had managed to build during his years at the top. Paisley Park Records, his own label and vehicle for many of his side projects, functioned as a joint venture, with Warner's underwriting distribution and marketing. Although some of the product emanating from Paisley Park had been widely derided as indulgences for Prince's latest girlfriend, there were also legends of times past on the roster, including George Clinton and Mavis Staples. Warner's, however, were sure that the whole enterprise was an uncommercial folly, tolerated as a favor to an artist who repaid them with insults. In February 1994, they pulled the plug on Paisley Park, withdrawing their distribution deal and sinking the business.
They certainly were looking to needle Prince and, you know, withdraw their support from something that he obviously still wanted to keep it going. He still had things that he wanted to release, side projects he wanted to release, and I think in withdrawing their support from that, it was a bit of a stab at, you know, Prince, who was going out saying Warners aren't letting me do what I want, where they said, well, if you're going to do that, then we're going to show you we're not going to let you do what we want, and you can't have the money to carry on doing it. When Prince started the label in the 80s, he had so many side projects and so much extra material that he could give away. It was kind of seen as an extension of the Prince world in a way. He had groups like The Time, he had Sheila E., he had Vanity 6, he later had Apollonia 6. These are side projects that he just seemed to be able to have enough material for his own work, for their work. Odd songs, you know, Manic Monday went out to the Bangles, where management would bring him new artists that could go under the Paisley Park label. He wasn't interested in what they were bringing him. It also became quite clear as time went on, I think, that Prince was kind of also interested in mostly producing albums by girlfriends. Kind of made Paisley Park a bit of a laughingstock because the quality from Prince's material wasn't there. Certainly the quality in the artist wasn't there. And so he ended up really asking Warner Brothers to bankroll a vanity label just as an extension of his playground rather than an actual working, functioning label. And again, I think Alan Leeds has gone on record as saying, you know, he had a tough time making Warner Brothers take Paisley Park seriously when Paisley Park didn't want to be taken seriously itself.
Everybody was frustrated with Paisley Park, the label, simply because, simply because the records had not been a successful label. Warner's was saying that it was because Prince wasn't accepting his responsibility as an A&R person. As a label chief, he wasn't producing the kind of product that was contemporarily competitive. His position was, my product is what it is, and it's your job to market and promote it, and you're failing me there. Both sides were right. It was a constant struggle to get any kind of major attention from the promotion and marketing people at Warner's. They wanted to be supportive, but they didn't really believe in the product. The fact is, we were giving them what those in the industry call difficult records, meaning they weren't easy to promote and market to radio, which at that time was the only way you knew how to promote a record, was to go to radio. They kind of had their heads in the sand as to any kind of alternative means of promoting and marketing, which was always a source of frustration to artists and producers. And to me as a label head, it was as well, because I said, you know, we've got some viable product here that people who find it really like it. It has a place in the market somewhere. So how do we get it to that place? And if we have to bypass the normal route of going directly to urban radio or pop radio, whatever these formats are, then isn't it our job to figure out the detour in order to reach that public? But the labels just weren't prepared to do that because they were on kind of automatic pilot. They had enough product to feed the machine, so they didn't have either the time or the energy to do anything that was the least bit creative or off-center.
Prince's frustration with the complacency of the music business, coupled with his immediate need to find a way out of the stalemate with Warner's, gave him a radical idea. He devised a plan to release a single independently and promoted himself via his new NPG Records imprint. Incredibly, Warner's granted him leave to do so, and on February the 14th, 1994, The Most Beautiful Girl in the World was issued globally, with distribution support from the small independent label Bellmark.
The litmus test was The Most Beautiful Girl in the World. Put the one single out, got the money behind it, the promotion, maxi single, you know, we did the whole world on that song.
With The Most Beautiful Girl in the World, they finally kind of gave him a chance to do that. I think they were fed up of the nagging, and I kind of think that they wanted it to fail. If they had believed that much in the song, they probably would have taken it for themselves. So what Prince did, he went off on his newly launched NPG record label. He plowed $2 million into financing and promoting the song and had this great worldwide campaign. He really created this great hype around the song so that by the time it was ready to come out, everyone would, you know, this was a really big deal.
It was unusual because I can't ever remember a superstar single being available outside of the normal distribution channels. It was harder to find than a lot of the other, than, you know, your average releases were, and there was a mail order campaign about it at the time, and it was fairly groundbreaking in terms of what he was later to do, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, in his career. He's always been looking for ways to go outside of the major label model.
All of this stuff that happens in the 90s, you look back on it and you think, pioneer. This guy is a pioneer. At the time, what Warner's was betting was, you want to release your music yourself? You think you know better than we do? And by the way, there had been arguments between them about what to put out as singles before this, and generally Warner's was correct and Prince was not. And so what Warner's is saying is, you want to do this yourself? Go right ahead. It's going to cost you a lot of money. You'll see. You need us. You don't really understand radio promotion. Costs a lot of money. You'll see. You need us. As it turned out, he has a hit with a big, soppy ballad.
Could you be the most beautiful girl in the world? It's plain to see you're the reason that God made a girl.
I think it deserved to go to #1. It was his first #1 in the UK. He proved, at least to himself, that he could still make hits, and it also allowed him, certainly it also convinced him to believe that he had sound business sense, that he could do this on his own. And I think Warner Brothers letting him do it in a way slightly backfired on them, because it kind of gave Prince all the ammunition he needed to be able to say, I can do this on my own now.
It was an incredible success. But that's one song, you know, and that's an engineered effort, and that was Prince's proof to Warner Brothers, you know, this can be done. You know, you guys are cramping my style and keeping me from, you know, being as successful with my music as I can actually be. So, you know, it was a good thing, it was a bad thing. Because if Prince has shown that he's correct in his revelation, you can't stop him.
Again, this is a prescient move. At the time, it just seemed a little weird, and it would get weirder. Every step along the way after this, things get stranger and stranger, and actually more difficult.
Although The Most Beautiful Girl in the World had been a global hit, it was not a magic bullet, and the wider problems persisted. Prince had recently suggested to the label that he would submit 2 new albums, Come and The Gold Experience, to be released on the same day, which would put them in competition with each other in the marketplace. Unsurprisingly, Warner's rebuffed the whole plan as a mad exercise in self-immolation and insisted that he work on improving Come. When it was released in August, Prince declined to engage in any promotion, describing the album as old material from a dead artist.
What's interesting is that Prince initially wanted to have Come out on the same day as the Gold Experience album, thereby pitting the two sort of brands, the Prince and the Symbol brand, against each other to sort of see which one would be successful. And you could kind of assume that Prince was hoping that the Gold Experience would be the more successful album. It's certainly the one that he was promoting at the time and the one that he was playing the songs from live. And so it's kind of a weird sort of murky period in Prince's career.
People didn't like this record, not because it's a bad record, it's actually a great record. It's a fantastic Prince record. Listen to it now, it's great. But it's an album of George Clinton, James Brown, avant funk. It's not a pop album whatsoever. And people did not know what to make of that record. Critics who want Prince to create pop songs disliked it somewhat intensely and very much wrongly. Fans simply didn't know what to make of it.
Come's a funny record. It's a very odd, it's a very muddled album, and it's certainly one of the more interesting of his 90s, though. I wouldn't say it's an out-and-out classic. It's bookended by these kind of nonsense songs, the title track and Orgasm, and from the very titles you kind of know what's going on with them. You get a few sort of dance tracks, Loose and Pheromone, that in the context of the times didn't quite work when they came out, but sort of in retrospect, they kind of dated a bit better than some of his other material has, so it's a weird little album.
Listen to it now, incredible. Holds up as good as the Black Album? Sure. Sometimes better? Absolutely. Then, just seemed like, wow, he'll do anything to get out of this record contract.
The problem is that it gets caught up in the whole Warner Brothers battle, and you have Prince by now what he's saying is starting to overshadow the music anyway, and it very pointedly has on the artwork the birth date of Prince, 1958, and the death date of Prince on there as well, the year the album came out. And so Prince obviously sees it as a record that's kind of closing a chapter for him.
The Rolling Stone assessment of Come isn't fair because it's a good record, and yet it's not inaccurate. It was another installment in a spectacular career derailment. Again, no one could see where this was going. It looked as though one of the greatest pop geniuses had renounced pop. It looked as though the person who had signed the biggest label deal in history had renounced his label. All of this didn't quite make sense.
With Come in stores, Prince resumed negotiations with the label over the fate of the Gold Experience, and the battle reached its nadir. Unable to find common ground, Warner's officially released the Black Album, an extensively bootlegged record that Prince had shelved in 1987. Blows were traded in the press, with both sides taking out mudslinging advertisements in Billboard magazine. Prince claimed that the Gold Experience was being deliberately suppressed by the label and insisted that he had a moral right to ownership of his masters, including his back catalogue. In the early weeks of 1995, he began to appear in public with the word slave slashed across his face.
I'm privy to a conversation that he had with Mo Austin around the time of the Gold Experience. He mentioned the Gold Experience as a record he wanted to put out. We hadn't begun working on this record yet. It was just a thing we had been talking about. And he got a phone call. He said he talked to Mo Austin on the phone, and Mo Austin was like, they talked about other business, and then Mo Austin said, okay, well, as soon as you get that Gold Experience record finished, send it right on, and we'll do what we know, we'll do what we do. And Prince said, I haven't even started on it yet. I'm just conceiving it in my brain. And Mo was like, well, either way, it's ours. So, and I think Prince at that point made an epiphany that this company thinks that they own the ideas that are in my head. I haven't even begun to put anything on tape. And they're already talking about what they're going to do with it. So I think that was really, that was the point at which Prince realized, I can't do this anymore. And he walks into rehearsal, he's got slave written on his face, and he's like, this is it.
I'm here with the New Power Generation, and the artist formerly known as Prince is a member of the band. He's agreed to his first television interview in over a decade, but is refusing to answer any questions. Now, the press keeps talking about the dispute with your record company. Is there a dispute there? I mean, it seems that's what's driven you out of America. That's what's made you change your name to an unpronounceable symbol.
He changed his name because his spirit told him to.
A spirit?
His spirit.
And do you feel freer now that you can't be addressed? A little bit? You seem to be fighting for freedom. What is it exactly that you want to be free from when you're talking about your record company? Is there something that you want to own? Is there something that you want to be able to edit? Is there something that you want to be able to say that you can't? Maybe Maite could tell me what? Do you want to own your own masters? No?
In your job, can you leave it if you want to?
Yeah, I can.
You can? Mm-hmm. Well, in the record industry, you can't.
But can't you just stop performing?
Yeah, you can, but
that doesn't
you can't
count
get
as
out.
leaving it?
Yeah, it doesn't count.
What is this, the firm?
Yeah.
You can't own your masters. You can only make, pennies on the dollar. Meanwhile, other people are, are just, they got fat mattresses and they keep shoveling money that they've made from your ingenuity, that you're never going to see. I don't think he only perceived his deal as unfair. I think it was a general feeling about the business that it's just unfair.
Maybe if he had come at it a little more everyman, I suppose, and explained himself a little more clearly, he may have gotten more sympathy. Would things have changed? Probably not, because he was really the first person taking this issue on at that level.
It's a business point that's become a culture point because of everything that's happened since, but there in the middle of the 90s, for an average music fan, it all seemed really weird. It's like, why do I care? Turns out we would all end up caring about this stuff, but we didn't know at the time. So I think people were aware that things were changing, but I don't think they had any awareness of what was to come.
Warner Brothers said something, and there was a rebuttal. This all went on in Billboard magazine for, a month or better. And I was like, wow, this is getting heated up, man. This is getting turned up. Like, who knows what's going to happen? And I remember Prince saying, like, listen, I don't know what's going to happen. They might try to send somebody. Somebody needs to know where the vault's at and how to get the key, because, who knows? I mean, big business is dirty.
Prince was by now firmly resolved that he could not work within the context of the established music industry, and that he would have to find alternative means of producing and marketing his art. He vented his feelings on a second New Power Generation album, Exodus, a collection of agitprop funk jams with lead vocals taken by bassist Sonny T. Rejected by Warner's, Prince released Exodus through NPR in total disregard of his contract terms.
Oh, well, when we grew up, we both had our own bands and we both were singers. And, we used to talk when we was kids, we talking about what we gonna do. Yeah, when I get my band, I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna get my band to do that. So it's really strange that he, as we grew up and that we both were in the same band. He, he knows I've been singing for years and stuff. So he's always like asked me to do something to sing. He's like, okay, would you sing on this record? I'm like, yeah. So that's how that came about. I count the days. Here's the interview. Here's the time. If I keep your secrets, will you keep mine? If we hurry, we can catch the train. If it was left up to you, I would die in a bed. That's why, baby, I count the days. From what I could tell, Prince was like, let's do a record on Sonny, why not? It started out harmless enough, but it quickly grew into a situation where Sonny, in my opinion, was the mouthpiece for Prince, and a lot of ideas Prince was having at the time. I mean, the Exodus has begun, man. That is, a verbal beatdown, if I remember correctly. I haven't listened to it in years, but I remember the first time hearing it after Prince put his vocals on and everything came together. I was like, wow. He has managed to channel his anger into a very specific phrases, and the syntax was so creative and spot on. It's whoever it was directed at specifically should have been really ashamed of themselves.
You have just accessed the beautiful experience. Welcome to the dawn.
Exhausted by the ongoing conflict and collateral damage to their brand, Warner's finally agreed to release the Gold Experience in September 1995, on the condition that Prince stopped defaming them in public. The album was warmly received and roundly praised as Prince's best work in years. It was clear from sales figures, however, that the dispute had taken a toll on his mainstream popularity. A few months later, the whole unhappy episode concluded as the parties agreed terms to end their relationship.
Enough was enough, and I think Warner's realised that this wasn't going to end unless, ironically, Prince kind of gets his way again. Not sort of unconditionally. What they ended up coming up with was an agreement that the Gold Experience would come out as a joint Warner Brothers MPG release, and then Prince would owe them 2 more albums from The Vault, and those would go on to be Chaos and Disorder and The Vault Old Friends for Sale, and these would be sort of collections of old material they would have on them, and stamped very pointedly, originally intended for private use only on the artwork and things like that, that would kind of show what feelings Prince had for these things. They were there, they were kind of, you take these and now leave me alone. And I think they were quite happy to get Prince off their back by that point.
The public battle between Prince and Warner Brothers didn't go well for anyone. It hurt Prince's career enormously because people felt he was entitled, and Warner Brothers statements just made them seem even more money grubbing than labels usually seem, which they seldom don't. It hurt both of them, especially in light of the Gold Experience album, which was the best album Prince had made, certainly since Diamonds and Pearls, and possibly even before that. And it was delayed for a year. It came out in 1995. There were at least 2 lyrics on the album that spoke about 1994 in the present tense, and he had been talking about it for a long time. But there was so much bile on both sides that the album wasn't able to be promoted effectively, and it's very hard when you work for a record company and an artist is talking shit about you to feel good about promoting the record and making them a star.
It was some of the strongest work we did, but the events and the emotional climate at the time was hardcore, man. I remember coming to rehearsal and just sometimes having a headache just from the stress alone of just, it was pushing us to our limits. I'll say that from as my opinion. We were all kind of just, wow, this is a weird place to be in and unpredictable from day to day. And Prince basically figured out a way to distill his derision into really great art. Prince was, in a way, returning to a form that was more familiar. There was really not, any rap music, any rapping going on. A lot of the musical arrangements were pretty straightforward. And again, less electronics, more real playing. In a way, it was a little bit like a chapter 2 of Diamonds and Pearls with a smaller ensemble and a lot of rage.
I think because it was such a scaled down record. It had some bells and whistles on it, but the core of the music was so organic, and you could just hear it come out over all the other things. There's a couple electronic little things on there, but I think because it was just so warm, the sound was warm to it, That was a great record.
Yeah, it's the one that's the best 90s album that Prince has released, and for very good reason. It's, again, kind of like Diamonds and Pearls was in a way. It's a collection of great songs. There's none of the high concept work. There's a bit of stuff. There's an NPG operator telling you Prince is dead. There's the segues, which are kind of designed to make it seem like you're listening to an interactive experience. You press a button and you get the Come experience or the Gold experience or whatever experience is coming out, and so, but that doesn't really detract away from what are great songs. You have P Control, which is a fantastic song. You have The Most Beautiful Girl in the World, turns up on an album there. You have Gold. It's kind of an attempt to do a Purple Rain for the 90s, but for me it kind of works as well. And it's that moment where his production was very heavy and very dense, but he hasn't quite overdone it just yet, and he still manages to bring out good songs.
Things like the NPG operator and downloading experiences, he just began to see a future, a time when things were more interactive, and I think in a way it's a metaphor for just removing the large corporation and being a more direct, source for, your audience.
In a schoolyard, a little girl skipping rope with her friends. A tisket, a tasket, no lunch in a basket. Your school books poor, the fight she would begin one day over this hoodie. She got beat for some clothes and a rep. With a chin up, she scolded, all y'all's molded. When I'm rich on your neck, I will step and step. You did to the straight A's, the college, the master degree. She hired the helpers that jumped up and made every one of them work for free. No, why? So, what if my sister's a trifling? They just don't know. Mama didn't tell him what she told me. Girl, you need pussy control.
The live shows off the back of this were great as well. It's a period that's sort of been reevaluated over the years. I think at the time, a lot of people went and were disappointed that he wasn't playing the old material, but he was going on stage playing the new material because he wasn't playing any Prince material anymore. And when you listen to a lot of the live shows now, you just realise that this is an album where he's still got it, and he's still staking a claim for himself in the 90s.
As a freshly minted independent artist, Prince started to make conciliatory noises towards his former employers. He claimed to harbour no ill will, and that his issue had never been with Warner Brothers specifically, but with the whole edifice of music economics. He made remarks to the press that were received at the time as oblique or eccentric, telling the NME that once the internet is a reality, the music business is finished. In retrospect, however, Prince's statements were prophetic, the portents of a man who had peered into the future and perceived the digital frontier with uncommon clarity.
In 1999, we'll be free and we can sell the music directly to the consumer. And we can give it away if we want.
In retrospect, Prince's problem really wasn't with Warner's as much as it was the industry itself. I mean, Prince was ahead of his time. He was absolutely right. Many of the things that he griped about, I thought he was dead on. Record companies had their heads in the sand. They were all on automatic pilot. The business model was stale. We would have meetings where he would frustratingly want to figure out alternative ways to release and promote records because he was so dissatisfied with how labels conducted business. Now, he was signed to Warner's, so of course his frustration is directed to Warner's because that's who he was in business with. But it wouldn't have been any different had he been signed to Columbia or RCA or any place else, because it was the business model itself, the industry, and how it functioned that frustrated him.
I really think that Prince is a person who has really great ideas, and he sometimes he's too far ahead of the curve, and other people don't know how to catch up with him, and maybe it's not even a good idea, because sometimes if you see too far into the future, it can be problematic for everybody involved. You know, I remember him telling us one day music is going to be sold, you know, back and forth by computers. And we're like, get out of here, man. What are you talking about? You know, but lo and behold, you know.
So many things in the story of Prince throughout the 90s feel anticipatory. Feels like he's Merlin, living life in reverse, right? So that in 1995, he says, well, if the internet really gets going, like if there's a real internet, like if what they're saying happens, it's the end of the music industry. And everyone says, come on, man, this is kind of nutty. It's because he's changed his name to the symbol thing, and he's writing slave on his face, and he's got that beard that's not quite a beard, but you don't know what it is, so we don't have to take this seriously. And it turns out he's completely right. Completely right. And his whole attitude about not owning his masters, not owning his publishing, owing his record company money for his work, all of this which leads him to declare himself a slave. Well, if you said that now, if you said the artist seemed enslaved to the record company system, everyone would go like, yeah, tell me something I don't know.
In 1992, Prince, he was Prince then, signed a $100 million contract with Warner Brothers Records, the biggest deal in the industry. But their deal turned into a public feud over who would have the control. In protest of that contract, the artist scrawled the word slave on his face. Y'all remember this phase?
All those years, or all those times you were walking around with slave on the side of your face. What was that all about?
To clarify that, so people don't get the wrong impression, I never meant to be compared to any slave of the past or any slave of the future. The slavery that I had undergone was in my mind, and as well as the business that I was in. We inked a $100 million deal with Warner Brothers, and that turned out to be a little less than desirable.
$100 million did?
The
whole
deal
deal?
did, yeah.
What all that meant?
Yeah. It's like I was saying before, that you can go in to record, you can go in to do some form of art, and if you you have any sort of chains on you, it's not going to come out as cool as it could be.
So you felt, as an artist, enslaved?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you've grown.
No, I'm pretty much the same size.
You know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really do feel I have inside.
Do you think that it would have happened to you had you not been enslaved?
Oh, no, absolutely not. And some days I want to just call up folks at Warner Brothers and just, I love you, man.
Really?
Yeah, just.
Because?
Of the journey, and they're part of the experience. I'm thankful to them for giving me the opportunity to be here talking to you. You know.
As time goes on, a lot of major artists today are now leaving their major record labels behind. Most notably, you get Radiohead doing that in 2007, and sort of striking out on their own, setting up their own boutique labels, and you get Jack White doing that with Third Man. Radiohead have done that when they released their In Rainbows album. And the thing is that Prince was sort of 10, 15 years ahead of all of these guys and trying to get away from a traditional business model where you had a major label that gave you money to do stuff and then you went on the back of that, and trying to take things under his own control.
Free to record, release and conduct his affairs as he saw fit, Prince set about reorganizing his life. In 1996, while Warner Brothers were promoting Chaos and Disorder, an album of cast-offs that they had received in the divorce settlement, Prince was dismantling the New Power Generation and putting together a different band, albeit still under the same name. He married Mayte Garcia, who subsequently fell pregnant with their first child, and relaunched his public profile, frequently granting interviews and appearing on television chat shows.
Please welcome back to the program the artist formerly known as Prince.
Tragedy struck towards the end of the year, when Prince and Mayte's son was born with Pfeiffer syndrome and died within a few days. Now carrying sole responsibility for his business affairs, Prince hid the news from the public, and rather than take a break, he ramped up promotional activity for his forthcoming album, Emancipation. Released on the 19th of November 1996, Emancipation was billed as Prince's definitive artistic statement. 3 discs of music held back from Warner's that represented years of his strongest work. Despite an initial surge in sales, however, the record slowly drifted out of view after only a few short weeks on the chart.
Emancipation.
3 hours of love, sex, and liberty.
From the artist formerly known as Prince.
I do remember a funny situation where Michael Jackson had just put out History. And Prince noticed in SoundScan that it was a double record, so he got credit for double the numbers. And Prince was like, I could make a 3 CD record and get triple the, like, I remember him saying that. I'm like, oh, well, yeah, sure, why can't you?
Sound-wise, I think there's a difference. I mean, that sound even moved into a different spot, actually, from previous things, because it was like more like he was like, I'm moving on from where I was. I'm trying to move to another level. I want to try something else,
He finally gets to release this triple disc album that he's always wanted to do. The thing is, by this point, it's 3 hours worth of Prince material that's kind of, it's sort of neither here nor there. There is some great stuff on it. There's Face Down, which is a kind of funky, upbeat song. It's hard not to enjoy that. When you get to the end of the second disc, you get a great run of songs where you really feel Prince is engaged with what he's doing. He is, he's about to become a father for the first time, or for the only time. And you can really feel this coming through in the music, and that is quite an enjoyable thing to hear. But over 3 discs, you also get a lot of stuff that's just kind of Prince doing R&B at the time.
I think that Prince made a real push and, was doing more interviews at the time. He needed to get out there because he knew the next step was going to be, I'm on my own, I need to reconnect with my fan base and gain new fans if possible. That was the feeling I got from Emancipation. That it was all about, okay, now there's a fear factor to being free.
And Prince's immediate fear was the parlous state of his finances. The toxic combination of lavish spending and declining income had driven him to the threshold of bankruptcy, and the mirage of the $100 million contract had long since vanished in the desert of his label war. Though shipping a 3-disc set had charged the figures and seen Emancipation certified platinum, the reality was that the album had sold barely 500,000 copies. During his time with Warner's, these figures would have seemed catastrophic, but in the new independent era, the picture was markedly different. With all revenues accruing directly to Prince, he found himself in healthy profit and was encouraged to bring his revolution to another branch of the music industry establishment.
The artist formerly known as Prince held a press conference Tuesday morning in New York City to announce his first full-fledged U.S. tour since 1991. The tour actually kicked off Monday night at Pine Knob near Detroit and continues Wednesday at Jones Beach in New York. The artist said that during the 30-date tour, he'll be joined at various dates by No Doubt, Lenny Kravitz, George Clinton, Chaka Khan, and Santana. He also said that he'll grant requests made over the internet on this tour and will be playing such classics as Purple Rain and Little Red Corvette. In order to avoid ticket scalping, he said he won't be publishing a tour itinerary. Instead, he'll be announcing shows through local media several days in advance of each concert.
Just as album releases traditionally took place via record companies, the live concert business was populated by squadrons of intermediaries, promoters, agents, and assorted middlemen that had designed the whole architecture of music tours. It was a system that ensured that together they culled a healthy profit from any artist going out on the road. Once again, Prince challenged the orthodoxy, embarking on a tour in which he handled venue booking, ticket sales, and marketing himself, cutting out concert promoters and ensuring that he retained all the fruits of his labor.
The sales for Emancipation wouldn't have really mattered to Prince too much. I mean, they would have to an extent, obviously, but he didn't need to make as many sales as he would have done under his old Warner Brothers contract. I think Emancipation sold about 450,000 copies, and Prince claimed to have been $5 million in profit. And I think if you look at it, people have suggested that for him to have even broken even under his Warner Brothers contract, it would have had to have sold 500,000 copies, which is more than the album actually did. So for Prince, it's an unqualified success. He has been able to come out like the most beautiful girl in the world when he released that as a single and it hit #1, and he's proved he can do it on his own. Certainly in financial terms, Emancipation has proven to him that he can do it on his own again. And Prince was out on the road for the best part of 12 months, so he'd be selling merchandise, he'd be selling gig tickets, and as long as people were coming to the shows, which they were in droves, Prince would just be making money hand over fist over these things, especially for being on tour for such a long stretch of time.
There were times when I remember the road manager and the booking agent at that time in the 90s said, okay, this is Monday, Prince wants to do a show on Thursday. A 20,000-seat arena. He just woke up and said, I want to do a show. And he's the only artist that I've ever worked with and have said, I want to do a show on Thursday, and here it is Monday at a 20,000-seat arena, and it sells. And I saw that happen many times.
The touring business, like the record business, had an established traditional business model. There were certain promoters that were experienced and legitimatized by their relationships with artists and managers, known to be dependable, efficient, and so on. And same with agents. And it was a network of people who were accustomed to producing tours and doing it properly and productively and profitably. And we were very successful into tapping into that network and exploiting it properly. Prince didn't make a lot of money on his most famous tours in the 80s simply because they were production heavy, which was something he insisted on. He wasn't the least bit interested in production budgets. We would bring things to his attention, and the pre-production phase was always painful because it would invariably be conversations like, Prince, that's a great creative theatrical idea, but here's what it's going to cost. Well, I pay you to go find the money. I don't care what it's going to cost. Make it happen. But it's very obvious to me that he's figured it out. He's figured out how to have a viable theatrical production that's competitive and proper, and at the same time streamline the number of people he has on the road and what he pays for and what he doesn't pay for. And by cutting out the, he's not paying management commissions, he's not paying percentages to a lot of people who take percentages in the traditional tour business model. So he is touring way more profitably now than he ever did in his peak years in terms of record sales. It's remarkable, and it's a credit to his business sense, because he's really figured out how to make a ton of money on the road without compromising the quality of his shows. And hats off. I think it's great.
In running concerts independently, Prince was estimated to have netted $30 million from 1997's Jam of the Year tour alone. In just 18 months, he had rebuilt his entire fortune and had done so on his own terms. Having relaunched his career, Prince was ready to turn his mind back to the future and venture into the unknown territory of the coming cyber age. He announced that he would release Crystal Ball, a box set comprising 3 CDs of material and rarities from the vault, together with a 4th disc of new songs entitled The Truth, if he received a minimum number of advance orders through his website, loveforOneAnother.com, and his phone line, 1-800-NEW-FUNK. It was a bold and unprecedented venture into e-commerce, but was beset by problems that provoked consternation among fans. As a first step to realizing the ultimate goal of becoming a self-contained artistic and commercial entity, however, Prince was off and running.
Prince doesn't get enough credit for what he was doing in the late 90s when Radiohead released their In Rainbows box set throughout their website in 2007. That's 10 years later, but people acted like it was the first time anyone had ever done this sort of thing. But what you get Prince doing in 97 is taking pre-orders for the Crystal Ball box set, and he became the first artist to sell an entire album online direct to his fans. The whole marketing thing, he went straight to the people who he wanted to sell it to. There was no middleman. There was no need for a record label. Prince just took it all under his own umbrella organisation. And I think that was incredibly forward thinking.
He'll have schemes, ideas that prove prescient. I'm going to take orders for my album online. I'm going to use a 1-800 number where you can call up and buy it like it's a telemarketed album. But I'm going to take orders online. Wow. Who does that? Will that work? In the 90s, nobody really knows. People haven't done it before. Now, of course, it is the entire record business. But then, it's a little weird, and it doesn't quite work. It ends up that the fans who order the record have to wait longer than the fans who go to the record store to buy it. They get different packages. People aren't sure what they're buying. Now it feels like things are unraveling. And again, Prince just keeps going forward and forward and forward.
Was it a feeling of him taking a lot on his shoulders? Yes, of course it is. Of course it is. I'm sure that was a heavy weight for him because he knew he was making a stance. It had not been done in that way. And the fact that he did it and he stood alone through all scrutiny, and I was there to witness that, but he kept going. He didn't complain. He just kept doing what he was doing. And I admired it. And I told him, I said, I really respect the fact that you're taking this stance, because there comes a time there has to be a change,
I think what he underestimated was the complications that can come in just with the busy work involved with physically packaging and mailing, going to the post office and mailing these things in a timely fashion is pretty damn labor intensive. I think he may have underestimated that part of it, but there again, that's just the busy work. It's the concept that we're dealing with here with a leader like Prince who has that kind of influence. So he was definitely ahead of the game. As to how much attention people were paying, I honestly think that by the late 90s, it was pretty clear to everybody who cared that, what Prince saw some years earlier was coming to fruition.
The corollary to Prince's criticisms of the record business came at the turn of the millennium, when the music industry suddenly, spectacularly, imploded. Over the course of the 1990s, the industry had become a risk-averse, money-making machine, monopolized by just a few major labels who used their muscle to arrange the market in their favor and dictated their terms to artists and consumers alike. The quiet migration of Prince and others to the internet proved to be the precursor to a general exodus. When the peer-to-peer file-sharing website Napster launched in 1999, consumers rushed to download and distribute music free of charge. And having neglected to develop a viable commercial presence in cyberspace, the industry was overwhelmed. Artists, most prominently Metallica, lined up to condemn Napster, and the Recording Industry Association of America began feverishly issuing lawsuits.
American intellectual property is our nation's greatest trade asset. We cannot stand idly by as our nation's assets are in jeopardy or dismissed by those who would use them for their own enrichment.
Record companies fought tooth and nail over the issue, and the courts agreed. It's the record companies who hold the patent on cheating musicians out of money.
It was rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. Although the cumulative weight of lawsuits eventually shut down Napster, the music business faced total collapse, and artists looked to establish a new digital economy in which to commercialize their work.
They had their heads in the sand, and the evidence is very plain and simple. Napster came from outside the industry. The record industry was so myopic about technology. All a record company knew in the 80s was if you had a new product, you went to the radio station programmers that you knew. You made a video and you took it to MTV and BET and anybody else who would play a video. And you had a PR person go to the print media and to any magazine and anybody else who might write something about your artist. You hired friends of friends. The people that worked for labels used to be programmers at radio stations. I mean, it was this inbred world that had fed on itself for so many years. And basically, it had worked so successfully, and so many careers had been made by it, and people were loyal to it, and they took vacations together, and they partied together, and they married each other, and it was this whole atmosphere of, we have this winning business model, so don't fix it if it isn't broken. Well, the problem was it was broken, or it was about to break.
You see, I'm not a Napster fan. It seems to me like people are getting ripped off. I don't understand it other than all I know is these people are putting money out, putting work out there, and somebody's enjoying it without paying for it.
Well, it's interesting because the artists don't get paid anyway.
Oh, by the record company?
No, I mean, there's maybe 10 or 12 of them that have semi-decent deals, and the rest of them are, you know.
What was happening in the record industry in the mid-90s was a transition from grunge to teen pop. That's a lot of money when you're selling a 35-cent product for $16. So the record bin it's making buckets of money. Buckets and buckets of money. Nobody thinks things are going to go bad. Nobody sees what's happening. Prince says, well, if the internet becomes a reality, you guys are finished. And what do you do if you're at a record company? You get back into the hot tub and you smoke another cigar when you hear that. You don't go like, I think he's right, because he's been right about everything else up till now.
It is this big, unwieldy behemoth now, and it's kind of also happily ripping off its customers. I think many people that's an agreement now. It was overpricing CDs. You know, now everyone knows you can buy a CD for 50p or something like that. Why were we being charged 18 quid for a single CD up to 25 quid for double CD discs? And it seems now in retrospect that the record label had become hugely greedy in the 90s and were more interested in, you know, making money over, you know, as opposed to making, say, art, quote unquote, or capital A art, however you want to put it. And so I think that by the time, you know, as Prince said, when the internet is coming, the industry is over, is because by the time things like Napster and everything came out, everyone realized that they were had been being ripped off for years.
Nobody saw the digital revolution coming to the public degree that Prince did. I don't think. Artists didn't. You'd hear people talking about it. There'd be various internet soothsayers going around saying what they expected could happen. But the concept of music being a digital file, the concept of music no longer being an object that you had to go to the store and buy, wasn't something that most people could grasp until Napster hit.
The industry was gone. It was over, just literally overnight. And I remember there used to be little signs of worry. Something's going to change here, but we don't know what it is. And we're not really taking the time to figure out what it is. We're just going to wait and react because what we have is too good. It's too easy, and it's working too well. So we'll just kind of wallow in it, and when the shit hits the fan, we'll react to it. Well, too late.
Prince's eventual response to Napster was to embrace it, publicly stating that there was nothing to fear, and even taking the radical step of releasing a single on the platform in 2001. In the late 90s, however, he was focused on the first work of a new era. Both Emancipation and Crystal Ball included songs that were a hangover from the Warner's period. But in '98, the first big release of all new material was announced. Confusingly, New Power Soul was credited to the New Power generation, although Prince energetically promoted it as his new album. He was accompanied during the campaign for New Power Soul by both former Sly Stone bassist Larry Graham and Chaka Khan, and he encouraged the public to buy their new records, which would be issued on his MPG label in a move that recalled the original concept for Paisley Park.
Well, with the gracious help of Warner Brothers Records, I was afforded the luxury of creating a state-of-the-art studio, and my dream was always to help my heroes. So they come to my place and they record for free, and all the rest of the money we turn into gold.
And you're going to be touring together too, isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
Now I know you wrote,
The New Power Soul, the sound he was creating for us and himself at that time was just something that's just another part of Prince. You know, in his head, he listens to so many different genres of music, and he respects so many artists. So it's amazing that he hasn't put out even more styles. So I looked at it as, okay, this is R&B, this is soul, this is rock, this is funk, this is, you know, it's a lot of things together. You know, I don't think any of us gave it any thought because we know how his mind works, you know. A lot of times when you are at majors, they make you stay in a genre and say, this is what you're known for, this is what we're gonna sell, these are markets that we have created for you, but he feels like market is universal. I hear the transition from what was his past to that time.
MPG getting it on, come on. What you could use a good loving, baby, instead of these young ass fools. I got the money for your muffin. Now, they the keys to the room. Come on, baby. Come on, chill.
New Power Soul was received poorly, dismissed by press and public alike. While it languished in the charts, Prince took possibly the worst public relations decision of his career. He started suing his own fans. In early '99, the first installment in what would become an unfortunate trend during his years as an independent artist hit the news. Writs were issued against fan sites, magazines, and message boards, alleging copyright and trademark infringement, and pulling music, video, and images over the course of an ongoing legal action. So far as Prince was looking to embrace the internet, it seemed that it would be exclusively on his own terms.
Prince started suing his fans in the late 90s. It was seen as hugely reactionary. I mean, first of all, they're your fans, they're the people you shouldn't sue. They're the people who supported him through Warner Brothers. But also, part of his problem was with the internet, and it started to seem that he was trying to control the internet. And you had David Bowie, who, you know, another early embrace of the internet with BowieNet and things. I think he said, you know, he didn't understand why Prince was doing this. And he said, you know, you can't stop this, you can't hold back the sea, I think he said, or something like that. And it kind of made, you know, a bit of a shame that Prince, the guy who had pioneered just a few years before, the internet distribution and you know, interacting with your fans on the internet, which is perfect for Prince anyway. He's quite a reclusive character, and it kind of allows him to interact with his fans while remaining at a certain distance. He's pioneered all this, and then, you know, his fans might have their own websites, and he kind of wants them to shut it down. And it kind of, again, it's not good PR to do that when you've made a point of breaking this new ground yourself.
I could say so-called fans on the internet, which is kind of a problem sometimes, because once they use the symbol, it's as though I've endorsed whatever it is that they have for sale.
I think it's more than a touch hypocritical. I understand the privacy issues. I understand the obtrusiveness of the press and the paparazzi. But I also understand that if you're a public persona and you make your living by marketing yourself to the public, that it goes with the turf. To turn your back on any and everybody who wants to pay you attention, well then, if that's the case, you should be the artist who privately makes records, does not tour, does not perform publicly, and stay in your house. If that's who you want to be, then be that. But if you're going to come out and sell tickets to 20,000 people to come hear you play and sit in a seat and stare at you, then you can't get angry because they're staring at you.
As his argument with the fans rumbled towards the courts, Prince stunned the music world by announcing his return to a major record label.
A 1 CD deal with a record company that is not your normal record company. Why'd you do this?
Well, Clive Davis and I sat down and talked about how to create an artist record label agreement that was in fact an agreement, not a contract. I'm not restricted by any means. I think all artists should be under agreements. Lenny Kravitz, for example, is a friend of mine, and we hang out and shoot pool all the time and talk about an album we'd make together. But, you know, he's still on the plantation, so when he comes on up north, gets with me, then we can do something for real.
About to divorce from Maite, and at a crossroads in his career, Prince sought to lighten the burden of self-releasing and thrashed out a one-album deal with industry heavyweight Clive Davis at Arista Records. Davis had been busy rehabilitating the career of Carlos Santana with Supernatural, an album that went on to become a record-breaking multi-platinum sensation. He spotted an opportunity to kickstart something similar with Prince and offered the artist an $11 million advance plus ownership of his master for Rave Into the Joy Fantastic to come out on Arista. On its release in November, however, Rave Into the Joy Fantastic performed poorly, with lead single The Greatest Romance Ever Sold only reaching number 63 on the chart. Prince blamed everything other than the work itself, accusing Clive Davis of breaking his promises and failing to adequately promote the album.
When Prince signed with Arista for Rave Into the Joy Fantastic in 1999, again, the model that he starts to work with at this time, and he'd done with Emancipation, he carried on to use this package distribution deal. So Prince would sign for a one-off deal, one-off album with the label, so that he would use their clout essentially to get it into shops and to get it out there, but all the recording costs and all the production costs and things like that, Prince would assume those himself. What it would mean is that he would owe nothing to the label, no recording costs, nothing like that. The label would have nothing to recoup because Prince had put all the money himself, but they would have the manufacturing, the distribution means to be able to get it out there, to be able to make it a high-profile release. So in a way, he's kind of piggybacking on the bigger structure that a major label has and kind of using those to get him into the shops. One of the problems that he had when he was releasing things on MPG, and this came out with the New Power Soul album, at the same time he had side projects by Larry Graham and Shaka Khan, and he was having trouble trying to get them into the shops.
And what Arista Records wants out of this is a chance to be part of the rebirth of a great artist, because they put out a Santana record. It's become the biggest record in the world. But the Santana record was a very craven commercial record where the artist listened to the record company step by step by step. The Prince album is an album that Prince made and brought to a record company and said, if you want it, we can do business together. It's an album made on his own terms, his own purposes. It's not a craven commercial record. It's not his best or his worst record, it's not a particular surprise that it isn't a big hit.
The disappointing response to Raven to the Joy Fantastic wasn't really that complicated to me. I think that an artist just reaches a point in their career where they're only relevant to their diehard fan base. And the phenomenon of buying their new music isn't the same as buying a ticket to see them perform. And when you go see them perform, if you're a real serious fan, you may tolerate them playing 2 or 3 new songs, but basically you go hear the songs that they made famous, and that's what you want to hear. And it's just nature. It's just, that's how it goes. So the fact that the record didn't sell through the roof isn't necessarily a statement that the record isn't good enough or it wasn't promoted properly. And interestingly, in his recently published book, which is a big, thick book in which Clive Davis talks about just about every record he ever had anything to do with, he doesn't talk about Rave. You have to ask Clive what that means, but it's a glaring omission. So there was something about that that didn't settle well, that's for sure.
With his status as an elite chart act vanishing, Prince turned his back on the mainstream and returned to the project of realizing artistic freedom in cyberspace. In 2001, he launched the MPG Music Club, a groundbreaking subscription website through which he issued smaller, more experimental records to a dedicated fan base.
The MPG Music Club is kind of the apogee of Prince's vision, if you like, of everything that he was working towards since leaving Warner Brothers. It's a subscription-based site, and I think the subscription started off at $100 and was dropped to $25 when Prince's sort of release rate slowed. But the idea being that fans would sign up to the music club, and in return they would get priority seats at concerts, they would get exclusive music club merchandise, they would get CDs sent to them whenever Prince had a new album. Instead of having to release it into the shops, he's giving it direct to the fan base, direct to the people that want it. And they would also get download music from him as well. This would turn up in their computer, and this is, you know, the Exodus album, the second New Power Generation album, terrible album as it is, this is stuff that he was talking about on that record, saying, I think there's a lyric or a spoken word piece that says, you know, you need to be free from a contract if you're able to download your music to your listener's computer or something like that. And sort of all these years later, that is what he's doing. It's the great combination of everything he's worked for, to be able to cut out the middleman, cut out a record label. Prince is on one side of the screen, his fans on the other side, and everything comes out direct to them.
Now tell me about the MPG Music Club. How does this work exactly? Right? You get the CD.
It works very well. It works very well.
But you have to order it through.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I couldn't. By dialing up www.mpgmusicclub.com, you can get access to brand new music as well as preferred seating at concerts. Also,
Well, now how do I become a preferred customer?
Well, you got some preferred money.
Prince's early efforts online were actually very strong when they worked, which they didn't always, technologically, I mean. But they were, I don't know if I'd say visionary, but they were very forward-thinking in terms of building a community himself. Artists have been very, very successful with that. In recent years especially, he was pretty far ahead of his time.
Fans who weren't signed up to that would have missed out on the One Night Alone solo piano album, which is a lovely little record and quite hard to get hold of now, I think. He had these NPG audio shows, you know, which are kind of like done like radio shows that you put online. There'd be online singles and stuff like that, and it just seemed like a new flow of Prince stuff to the people who wanted it, as opposed to having to get sort of in chart battles and stuff like that. And I think for him it was a success. Prince was totally blazing a trail for this and pioneering it, and you find out in a few years' time when he starts his Musicology download store. I think he even opened that online download store even before the iTunes store started, by a matter of months you're talking, but still Prince is, just goes to show that business-wise Prince is there really up with what's going on. He really understands how this thing works.
Having established the Music Club, Prince issued a new studio album, initially through the club and subsequently on general sale. Titled The Rainbow Children and released in November 2001, it accompanied a series of changes in the artist's life and identity. Almost unnoticed by the wider public, the infamous symbol had been dropped and Prince had reverted to using his original name. He had also come out as a Jehovah's Witness, having been gradually initiated into the faith by his spiritual mentor Larry Graham over the course of the late 90s. Indeed, on New Year's Eve 2001, Prince married his new partner Manuela Testolini in a Jehovah's Witness ceremony.
Larry Graham taught me so much. Larry, could you just stand up? That's a 1 in a million brother right there, Larry Graham. I learned so much from him musically, and then when I met him, he's taught me so much about the truth.
The artist joins us. Great to have you here. Happy holidays.
I don't celebrate the holidays, but thank you very much.
Well, it's nice to have you here at this time of the year.
The more I study the Bible with the help of Larry Graham and some of my good friends, I realized that the hard feelings I had weren't really directed towards them as it was the idea of this thing, like I say, called entropy. We're getting to the point now where the truth is being lost in music. I was discussing this with Larry today. We were just discussing the word inspiration and where we think it originated from. And ultimately, you know, if you go back, your father may inspire you, and then that your father, his father inspired him, and his father may have inspired him.
Eventually we get to Adam.
Yeah, and eventually Adam had a father. When you get the inner calling to do something and you know that you're being inspired by God, and you pretty much know you better answer that call or suffer the consequences.
Do you think this was God-inspired as well?
I do believe, yes.
The Rainbow Children was a musical exploration of the Jehovah's Witness religion, and perhaps unavoidably, it polarized opinion.
When the Rainbow Children came out, interesting little time, because Prince, for the first time in years, he goes back to calling himself Prince now. And I think you can look at that as being what he's got as an album that it's so dear to his heart. It's so, it's an exploration and a celebration of the Jehovah's Witness faith. So no wonder he's calling himself Prince again. This is the album that he is returning with. I believe it's his most artistically successful album of the new millennium. He hasn't done that recording album that has been as satisfying a listen since, as a whole album. The problem is that unless you're a Doubt Jehovah's Witness believer, it's a real turn-off, because it's the hardest aspects of his faith.
I thought musically it's his best, most cohesive post-Warner Brothers record. I thought it had the most interesting collection of songs. What I didn't like was the annoying, what I thought was annoying kind of narrative segues in between the songs, and some of the controversial politics in some of the lyrics that touched on religion and so on. But as a result, I thought it was kind of shamefully overlooked, because I think musically it's probably his best album since the Warner Brothers years.
The moment where he is an artist again, he's creating a successful artistic piece of work after years of trying to chase trends or chase sort of whatever's going to sell. This is an album that it's not concerned with sales, it's concerned with what Prince wants to say, and you can feel that in the album. But lyrically, this concept about, it's a thinly veiled story about the Jehovah's Witness faith. It's got this slowed down sort of godlike voice who's a narrator on it, which it's kind of heavy going lyrically. You kind of have to actively shut that part, unless you're totally into this, you have to actively shut your brain off to that sort of part and just enjoy the music for what it is. And the music is fantastic, and it's an album that should certainly be discovered more than it is. It's kind of seen as the Jehovah's Witness album by many, apart from the hardcore fans, anyone who knows it, oh, it's the one where he's Jehovah, but it's actually just a fantastic, fantastic piece of work.
The Rainbow Children failed to make any impression on the public consciousness, and the trend continued over the next few years as Prince released a succession of niche albums via the Music Club that anyone beyond the subscription list would have scarcely been aware of. A high-profile re-emergence came in 2004 with a flamboyant performance at the Grammy Awards, where Prince played a medley of hits alongside Beyoncé. The show was lauded as a stunning comeback, with critics heaping praise on the stagecraft and musicianship. As a show business personality, Prince found himself suddenly thrust back into the limelight after years of invisibility.
Nostalgia follows cycles. An artist has to go away for a while to be missed. And Prince's sort of self-imposed artistic pig-headedness, you know, I'm doing this and everybody will follow me or don't, that isolated him to a degree. No record label, no promotion. Enough years had passed from the battles with Warner Brothers and all the weird stuff he was saying. And he was back, and he was approachable, and he was on TV, and there he was on the Grammys with Beyonce, taking his, getting his propers. You know, his music was coming back in a lot of ways. It reaches a point with an artist where their greatness, no matter how strangely they've behaved, no matter how many bad recordings they've put out, their greatness becomes undeniable. And that's when you start looking backward.
Oh no, let's go. If you don't like what you're living in, take a look around. If you got a friend, come on, lady, friendly word. Pick up the phone, touch it on the floor. Thought I heard. Are we gonna let the elevator bring us down? Oh no, let's go. Oh, crazy. Sing it, y'all. Go, 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 go. Go crazy. Go, 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 go.
The fact is that anybody who cares to know recognizes that Prince is one of, if not the most influential, brilliantly gifted rock stars of the last 40 years. There is no question that the younger artists, particularly in the black music realm, basically worship him as a mentor, as someone who opened doors for them in incorporating rock and other elements into the music. He arguably changed the music and what was expected of and what was appropriate for a young black artist to do. And he's an icon to anybody who cares about that kind of stuff. So the fact that he has that kind of influence, and the fact that someone as hugely successful and contemporary as Beyonce would give him that kind of dap on stage in public is a smart move, because it reminds the casual fan of his iconic status.
It's seen as this great reemergence of a guy. Where's he been for so long? Oh my God, look at him. And there's a sort of certain vagary aspect to that performance, but he totally nailed it. He's looking great in his purple suit. He's with Beyonce. They're, you know, trading off each other. And, you know, for a sort of brief slot on the Grammys, it's a fantastic sort of return to prove that he's a great hit-making machine, remind people of these hits in the first place, and sort of sets himself up then for, you know, one of the greatest successes of his career.
Prince capitalized on the Grammy performance by holding a press conference in which he announced a forthcoming album, Musicology, and an accompanying tour, while also objecting to talk of a comeback, noting that he had never gone away. Both the album and tour were enormously successful. Musicology climbed to #3 on the Billboard chart and was nominated for 5 Grammy Awards, while the tour was the year's #1 concert draw, giving Prince his longest run of gigs since Purple Rain and pulling in an estimated $87 million.
Speaking of comebacks, Prince played 2 sold-out shows at the Air Canada Centre this past week, and the concert-goers received his latest CD, Musicology, and they were entertained to more than 2.5 hours of new songs and, of course, classic hits.
You got to feel the body moving, just like I told you.
The best concert I've ever seen.
I feel that I can die now. I saw Prince. I'm so happy.
That guy has moves. I love it. I've never seen a concert so magical.
Hearing his hits again were awesome.
Get your hand $1 and turn to sing.
Did you guys buy any merchandise while you were in there tonight?
No.
Was it really expensive?
It was extremely expensive. That little t-shirt was $45, but it was well and worth it.
No, too expensive. T-shirt was started at $45.
Yeah, $50. It went up to like $100 for like a little t-shirt. I bought a t-shirt. Yeah, how much was it?
Who cares? I will frame it.
The album's very good. Does it get the respect that it deserves? No, of course not. Because again, this is this moment where people are discovering that what they want out of Prince is this incredible live moment. And in a way, can you blame them? You know, there's musicology. It's a great Prince album. Well, I got a great Prince album. In fact, I've got 6 of them. I don't know if I need another. This is, again, why the music business transitions more into a live business than a recorded music business. Not just because people can get the recorded music for free, but because the live business, sometimes they refer to it as a perishable experience. You know, a little term of business that you don't hear much unless you're in the music business or the sports live entertainment business, anything that is a live moment. It's thought of as a perishable experience because if you're there, it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And when Prince is up at the Grammys, people realize, oh, snap. If I don't show up at his next concert, I might miss this.
The Musicology Tour. Prince performing his greatest hits live for the last time. Center stage in the round. By overwhelming demand, 2 shows have been added. May 24th at Arrowhead Pond of Anaheim and May 26th at Staples Center. Don't wait. Get your tickets now at the Pond box office, Ticketmaster, charge by phone or online. Buy a ticket and get the new Prince CD free. Prince.
He came to maybe a realization, maybe just a tipping point with things. Maybe he was just tired of a really small number of people caring about what he was doing. And when he would play the older songs at the concerts, he probably was struck by the difference in the reaction. So the 2004 tour, that tour was really, really interesting because you had both old songs and you had a few new songs, and it was the sort of classic model you see with a lot of artists today. He hadn't been playing the hits on a big stage for a really long time. So the 2004 tour was in many ways a comeback tour. He did play some new material on those dates. And it was like when you'd go to see the Rolling Stones. It's like, you know, they play Miss You and everybody jumps out of their seats, and they say, okay, here's a new song, and everybody takes a bathroom break. There was a lot of that going on. That was an enormously successful tour. It put a ton of money in his pocket. It got a lot of his swagger back, I think, and he just looked great, he sounded great, and people realized how much they had missed him. And by airing a lot of those old songs again, he allowed people to realize how much they had missed him.
Musicology proved to be yet another innovative leap in post-Napster business practice. Leveraging his stratospheric popularity as a live draw, Prince gave away copies of the album with concert tickets as he looked to maximize revenue from his shows. To his enduring satisfaction, the results of the move provoked howls of protest from the major record labels, but it also sparked an industry-wide shift from CDs to gigs as the primary source of artist income.
With the Musicology release in 2004, Prince went back to a major label again, this time Columbia, to sort of give them the P&D deal, the one-off deal with that. But he came up with an interesting deal this time round, and so they would put it in the shops, but he would be allowed to put it out through his website, the Musicology record store, which he launched, a sort of download store, which was a great success for him. But also he gave it away free with tickets to the Musicology tour. And this is where it starts to get interesting for Musicology and Prince, because what happened was Nielsen SoundScan ended up having to count those ticket giveaways because there was a purchase, because someone had given money and received the album in return. They ended up having to count those ticket giveaways as sales. They did it from the day that Musicology entered the store as well, but what it meant was that the album all of a sudden hit number 3 in the chart and became an unqualified success for Prince, when really, he hadn't had a chart success in a long time.
The rules were made by people who don't really play music, so I think some of them need to be rewritten.
In fact, I believe SoundScan has already changed the way they're going to account for other groups in the future who use the same strategy here, but you've been grandfathered in for Musicology.
Well, to some degree we have. All truth be told, SoundScan has not really counted all the albums that have gone out to concert goers. And the album is included in the ticket price, and we do get paid back for the album sale. At the same time, there's roughly 450,000 copies that they haven't counted. So,
a stroke of brilliant luck, if nothing else, because all of a sudden he had a record that qualified for a chart impact. Those qualified as sales, Billboard quickly changed that afterwards. Yeah, I thought it was brilliant.
You're using Columbia to manufacture and distribute the CD, but that's it. Talk to me a little bit about the role of music labels.
Well, for real artists such as myself, I'm trying to make a career out of this. So I don't want to just have one album and then out of here. That's what a lot of young acts are about these days. And the record companies are cool with that because then they kind of get a disposable, quick fix of these young acts and then move on to the next one. They also don't have to make any long-term deals, which means that the act is going to make a great deal more money than just coming out with their first record. The situation I have with Sony is unique in the sense that they respect my career and they understand that it's important that we own the work, so there isn't an issue about that, and they've just been beautiful all the way around.
It doesn't really matter if the album is going to be a commercial success or not, or what's on it in this case, because it's less about the new album. Prince is not going to play a great deal of songs from it anyway, he's going to play the hits again, than it is about getting people to come and see him live. And so instead of trading off on his new music, he starts to trade off on his live show, which is, he's always had a fantastic live show, but he really starts to push that forward. Then what you see coming down the line, you see, not long after this, you get this whole concept of 360 deals, and you would get major artists signing to tour promoters rather than to record labels, because the feeling starts to become that artists are going to make their money through the live show. They're going to make their money through merchandise sold at the desks. They're going to make their money through ticket sales. They're not going to make their money anymore through the release of a new album. And so people start to, they're musicians. They kind of have to put out new albums if they want to at least have the semblance of being relevant in today's marketplace, or still seem as though they're not necessarily oldies acts. But everyone is really starting to gear their business model around the tour. And Prince, with musicology, with that being counted as ticket sales, Nielsen had to change the way they counted these things after he kind of shook up the business again.
I mean, the title of the tour said it all, musicology. It was back to the music as the focal point, which at the end of the day is what saved him touring-wise, because he had been before that playing theaters and straining to sell them out, and all of a sudden he's back in arenas and has stayed there since. So I think the musicology tour was a kind of a wake-up call for him, that if you pay a little more attention to the music and less attention to the bells and whistles, the people will come.
Prince moved to consolidate his recent surge in popularity with a new studio album in 2006. During sessions for 3121, he redrafted former members of the new power generation to help in assembling a collection of songs that would recall his classic sound. When drummer Michael Bland and bassist Sonny T arrived to start recording, they found that their former band leader was now carefully operating like a seasoned business executive.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
You once labeled your time at Warner Brothers as slavery, so why are you jumping aboard the biggest slave ship of them all?
I don't consider Universal a slave ship, first of all. Mostly, the situation with Universal is similar to the one with Sony in so much as that I did my own agreement. It wasn't a contract. I don't believe in contracts, but I did my own agreement without the help of a lawyer, and sat down and got exactly what I wanted to accomplish, the goals that I was trying to accomplish.
We had made kind of an arrangement, because I don't think he knew how many songs he really wanted to record, or what was going to happen to any of it. So, we had literally a formal agreement about, I think he had become more cognizant of just how business works. And I think for his own protection and to be able to, show the nuts and bolts of it, literally, we had a contractual agreement before we played a note. And there was a sum of money, and it was real nice, and we probably cut 11 songs that night. Sonny and I were just kind of grooving for a minute, and he walked into the studio and picked up a strap, oh, this is cool. And that ended up being 3121, We were just checking for the engineer, and Prince was like, I saw him roll that tape, dude. And we were just boom, 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 just grooving. He just grabbed his guitar and all right. Figured out what key we were in, and just away we went.
It's like coming home for a minute,
It's great. I mean, you know, the sound is really tight. You know, I mean, you know, his guitar playing had moved to another level from the last time I played with him. You know, and that's what the most you can hope for, is to be better than what you were 2 or 3 years in the past, you know, if you're still working on your craft. I mean, if you get to the point where you just stop and then you just start being a novelty, you know, it's time to just be a record exec at that point. So he's still constantly growing and changing the way I see it.
It was his funkiest album in a really long time. He wasn't afraid to look backward. There were some synthesizer sounds on there that sounded like they came from Dirty Mind. There were, the first song on it sounds like something from the Black Album. Okay, his voice is very speeded or very sped or however you say it. Real fat, hard bottom, you know, lots of bass. It was a really swaggering album, but there were also a couple of good ballads on it, stronger melodies than he'd had in a long time. And it was also the first record he'd ever made with Universal, which got behind it and was able to play a pretty big role in making it a hit.
Of the sort of late period, you know, commercially minded records where he's trying, you know, he's trying to sort of make an album sound relevant. It's not a flawless album, it's not even a classic album really, but it's the best of that bunch. It's the one where it sounds like he's trying a bit harder and he's, you know, putting a bit more effort into it. He's totally trading on his past with it. He's nicking call and response motifs from Time Records to throw onto the end of Lolita. He's, you know, Black Sweat is quite a cool little track, but it's really a track that, you know, it's kind of, it's another Prince track that he's done the sort of thing of loads of times before. You've got a song on there, The Dance, which is one of the main highlights of it, but that came from, you would have found that before on the Chocolate Invasion album, so that's an old song that he's kind of reworked and re-recorded for this record. So it's not like Prince has just come up with a modern Prince album, you know, that's the most amazing album ever, but it's kind of the most successful of those ones for me, I think.
3121 was the first Prince album to debut at #1, and it confirmed his mainstream comeback. Over the following year, he gave a series of gala performances, including a residency in Las Vegas and the halftime show at the Super Bowl, playing the hits under his newfound status as a timeless American icon. Belated recognition for his online initiatives also arrived, as Prince received a Lifetime Achievement Award at the internet industry Webbies. Though only a few weeks later, he closed the MPG Music Club and announced that he was temporarily withdrawing from the web.
I think Prince caved to his legendary status. I think he probably did that early in this millennium. I think that happened with the 2004 tour when he started airing the hits again. And I think he just decided to not necessarily stop, but not exclusively bang his head against the wall trying to get his new material across to whatever audience would listen to it. All of those things contributed to that. Those are the biggest stages for an artist. The Grammys, the Super Bowl, greatest Super Bowl performance of all time.
Purple rain, purple rain. Purple rain, purple rain. That's alright. Come on, y'all. Purple rain, purple rain. Oh yes. Don't it feel good? Only wanna see you, see you. Can I play this guitar?
It's hard to imagine that ever being topped. He was at his best. He knew that dozens or hundreds of millions of people were watching him, and he owned it. He was absolutely phenomenal. Getting $5 million to play Coachella, all of those things are him accepting it, playing the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and stealing the show. Okay, Prince has always been one of the greatest guitarists of the rock era, but because he does so many other things, people don't really realize it. That really established him there. Even the guys on stage with him, you see them watching him play and they're just like, damn. All of those things were him finally embracing his legendary status and not shunning it.
And in characteristic style, Prince used this legendary status to once again push the frontiers of accepted business practice. In July 2007, he released another new record, Planet Earth, for free on the cover of UK newspaper The Mail on Sunday. The giveaway was tied in with the forthcoming residency at London's O2 Arena. When both the 21 nights at the O2, as well as after shows at the Indigo 2 Club sold out, Prince had established yet another new model for the live performance market and rethought the role of albums within the context of artist income.
A lot of the songs on Planet Earth are very soothing for me. So it to me represents a time that he felt a lot of peace, a lot of calm, you know, of course a lot of spirituality. A lot of it was really melodic. I remember being on stage at our first sound check in the O2, and one of the songs we were singing, we were rehearsing, and I kind of got lost in the song. I closed my eyes and I missed some of the choreography transitioning. And I looked up, I opened my eyes, and there he was on that big stage standing right next to me like, I said, oh God, I'm sorry. He said, you were really into that. I said, yes.
With Planet Earth, Prince gave that one away with the Mail on Sunday in the UK. He had a worldwide sort of deal with Sony for other territories. Now, the interesting thing is that part of that deal included a UK Sony distribution, and they didn't seem to be in on this at all. They didn't know it was going to happen, so all that happens is all of a sudden Prince's new album is a giveaway in the newspaper, and there was outrage. It was amazing because people were saying, on the one hand, you know, we've had cover mounts for years. This was the first time a new album was ever given as a cover mount, not an old sort of catalogue piece. And so one side of the industry was saying, well, it cheapens the music. If you're just going to give away new music, you know, the industry is in dire straits as it is, you can't just give this away. Prince's argument, however, and what he claims he said to Sony was, well, I've just reached 300,000 people in one day. Were you going to reach the same amount of people with the album on the first day of sales? Which he would say, no, you weren't. For Prince, it was an unqualified success because he's got a new album out to as many people as he can. The issue of the Mail that sold was the second biggest selling issue that they've ever had underneath Diana's death. So, you know, it was kind of a win-win for everyone. And I think Prince is estimated to have made somewhere between £200,000 and £500,000 off of this deal with the paper, which is probably more than any advance he would have got for the one-off deal for the record in the first place from the record label. And Prince again gave it out with tickets, you know, gave the album free away with tickets for his 21 nights stand in London. So you start to see again, he's using the new album to drum up interest in his long residency in London. And that's where the real money's coming in this time, because with 21 nights, he's not moving around.
He was elated. Totally. And we were happy because we only had one location. We didn't have to move around, you know, so we had apartments there, and he dressed up the Indigo, made it look like Paisley Park with all his beautiful furniture and candles and incense, and, you know, made an environment for us there. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. You know, he loves what he does, obviously, but it's a business for him. It was an opportunity for him to just go and basically turn his playhouse into something that's like a kingdom, and he could just really just have fun and just do, you know, what he does and make money, of course, too.
Go to the master plan before she give up the good thing. Go to jail. Go ahead, Chelsea. No blood diamonds, I decided she threw up in the door, my head down to her feet. You can hate if you want to, Chelsea don't need no me. Say it, still got blood like a letter C. Come on, girl. Chelsea rises was the model.
After the O2 residency, Prince starts charging several $1 million for one-off appearances at Coachella, private parties, things like that. And you really get the sense that Prince, as an artist, is perhaps less interested in being currently an artist. He is more interested in staging live events that he knows he'll get sales, merchandise sales, and really seeing the money.
Understand that the music industry right now is essentially a live industry. The recorded music industry continues to struggle. The live music industry had its struggle several years ago, but right now is enormously healthy. And that artists of Prince's stature could tour if they wanted to, year after year after year, playing the hits.
Prince's approach to becoming the world's biggest independent artist was to do just that. Over the next few years, he continued to foreground live performance while looking for ways to experiment with new business models. In in 2009, he broke with the pattern of single album deals with a record label and released a new album, Lotus Flower, under an exclusive agreement with the retailer Target, cutting out the major label distribution infrastructure entirely.
3 new albums, including one from Bria Valente, all for only $11.98. Available this Sunday.
Lotus Flower was accompanied by a new subscription website in a further attempt to commercialize his music on the internet. But neither the album nor the website generated much enthusiasm from the public. A year later, another new record, 2010, was issued again as a newspaper cover mount, but failed to replicate the success of Planet Earth as the suspicion grew that Prince was pursuing business goals at the expense of artistic quality. However, in 2013, a more promising project emerged when Prince announced the formation of a new band, Third Eye Girl, and a new artistic vision began to take shape.
I would say that as Prince's career has gone on, certainly in this late stage, he is much more interested in the money side of things than in the new art side of things. I think the Warner Brothers thing, it kind of left his scars with him, obviously. And yes, part of the argument was that they were stifling him as an artist, but I think also it's quite clear from his actions that part of the reasoning behind it was that they were also getting more money than they should have for his work. Interesting to see what he does next, because he's got this Third Eye Girl project at the moment, which is one of the more interesting things he's done in a while. Instead of just being, turning out the hits, as you've heard the hits for years and years and years, he did that for the best part of a decade. He's now got a sort of all-girl 3-piece power trio behind him, kind of hit or miss material, but at least he's trying again to find some sort of artistic interest.
As Prince took to the road with Third Eye Girl, the issues that he first confronted 2 decades earlier continued to preoccupy the music business. Artists' rights, the digital economy, and how to commodify art in the 21st century have now become mainstream concerns, grappled with by musicians and artists across the spectrum of popular culture. What was first seen as a marginal tiff between a superstar and his paymasters has proven to be the opening argument in a much wider conflict. And Prince, a much misunderstood visionary, the leading thinker in the post-millennial music industry.
Well, it always takes one. It takes one person to stand up and say, this is wrong, and I'm not going to take it. If you take it, you're an idiot, And I think Prince ended up being that figure, tragically, with no one really understanding, and having to stand on his own little area of land and claim it. A lot of people couldn't relate, I don't think. It probably is a precursor to a situation like Napster had with Metallica, where, you get these, bloviating, these bloated rock stars going, hey man, we have $80 million, but we're supposed to have, $200 million. It's because you people are stealing our music, and somehow they didn't, often when the wealthy make a stink about something, people are skeptical. And sometimes they're right to be so, and sometimes not.
I really feel like the business world will catch up with him and will acknowledge the things that he tried. He was the canary in a coal mine for an awful lot of things. It's going to be interesting to see how history looks back on his business efforts, because he has tried almost everything.
I think people have learned that they can do it themselves, and that you don't have to rely on somebody else to fulfill your dreams. And the real deal is that what people don't realize or know is that Prince plays music because he loves to play music. It's for the love. It's for the love. Prince could be one of the most generous people you ever met. He can also be shrewd and terrifying. But the music is about the love.
He's kind of found a place of comfort that he seems comfortable with, that works for him. And if you want to revert to measuring success in terms of numbers, the tickets he sells is phenomenal. And certainly suggests that the world at large recognizes the icon that he is, the enormously talented, gifted performer that he is. I think in some ways, the fact that he doesn't have to pretend to compete with the Jay-Z's of the world really puts him in a place where it may just be the best years of his career.
up women for the stripes of the road. Learn the meaning of grace as when his cup overflows.
The story of Prince and Warner Brothers is so interesting because Prince is the echt example of what Warner Brothers considered itself to be about. That is, artist development. Even though Prince wasn't exactly the artist they were thinking of when they created that philosophy in the 60s and 70s, the way that Warner Brothers worked was, we want to sign geniuses and give them room to develop as geniuses. And if they have hits, that's great. Prince is signed as a teenager to a fairly rich, somewhat extravagant multi-album deal. By today's standards, it's insane. He hasn't proven himself. He lives in Minneapolis. He makes a kind of music that generally doesn't sell that much. It can do well on the R&B charts, but at that moment, Prince is signed in the 70s, Michael Jackson is really still a kid. There's no thought that he's going to be the huge pop success he becomes.
The relationship between Prince and Warner Brothers was never warm and fuzzy in the sense that he was never the kind of artist who would drop in the office and just hang out, or work the building, as we used to say, from a promotional marketing sense, walk around, bring flowers to the receptionists and flirt with the assistants. And I mean, he wasn't that guy. There were a lot of artists who did do that. They understood the edge that it gave them and the motivation it brought to the people who worked at the label on their behalf. That was something that Prince had absolutely no interest in. He may have at least grudgingly understood the need for it and just felt that, hey, that's what I hire you people for. Go work the building, do what you got to do. I don't care what you have to do. I don't care how you do it. You don't even need to report to me about it. I make music. I don't do that.
I don't think he has a very long attention span. Prince can get bored very easily. So I think that was probably part of the conflict between him and Warner Brothers, actually, is that you have a person who is vital, who is interested in getting ideas out immediately, because if they sit too long, they're going to die on the vine. And as an artist, I can completely understand that. But, you know, I can see the side of a corporation going, well, wait a minute. We have 1,300 other artists we got to deal with, you know, in this time frame. And we only have so many, you know, minutes a week. And so I just think, you know, it's a situation where, I mean, eventually they were going to have to part ways because Prince was just cranking it out. And they were like, well, what do we do with it? So, you know.
Prince was both prophetic and way ahead of his time when it came to understanding the effect that the digital age would have on the music industry. You must understand that this was a guy who was already looking for alternative means to market and promote music to the public because he was so dissatisfied with the old business model. We had a meeting, and this would have been 1990, 1991, where he called me in, and it was after he had delivered a record to Warner's and was frustrated because they weren't in a hurry to put out another record. Again, the subject matter had once again become the fact that he was too prolific in giving Warner's product too quickly. And in his frustration, he was expressing to me, you know, we've got to find another way to get music to the public. In fact, what if we went to late night television and did like these oldies packages that people sell, and we actually marketed a record on our own label to the public, and we just sold it by mail order. We just do television adverts late at night, and people write to post office box, whatever, and we sell it through the mail. And I said, yeah, that's great, except for one problem. You're under contract to Warner Brothers. You can't legally do that. Well, then it'll be your label. You do it. And we'll put a different name on it. Instead of Prince, we'll put something else. And I said, yeah, but they're not going to, Prince, they're not going to sit and let you do that. If you run a business, you can't allow that to happen. So put your Warner's hat on for a minute. Pretend you're Mo Austin. What would you do? You're going to get a cease and desist, and you're going to legally prevent us from doing that. Well, I don't care. We got to do it. And I said, furthermore, I'm president of a label that's a joint venture. I can't, you're going to have me in jail. I can't be part of that and put it on my label. I create a label. I can't do that. Well, then put it in your wife's name. We'll call it Gwen Records. He was serious. And I knew then that he was going to figure out some way to beat the system. Even if it wasn't legally acceptable, he was going to push the envelope. And of course, that became NPG Records. It became the record he made that ended up coming out on NPG under the name of the band that was really a Prince record that Warner's had rejected.
I think when Prince changed his name, it was certainly damaging to his public image. You've always got a hardcore group of fans that are going to follow him wherever he goes, but then you've got a wider audience that he had a lot of salient points in what he was talking about when it came to artist rights, when it came to things like, owning your master tapes. One of the things he kept saying, again, with the tricky slavery imagery, is if you don't own your masters own you, meaning that if he didn't own his master tapes, then Warner Brothers were always going to own him. But all of these salient points about artist rights and about freedom for an artist to create and to present their work to the public kind of got lost in the name change and the name calling between him and Warner's. And it wasn't, kind of typical Prince. It wasn't well explained enough for people to be able to really get what he was trying to say, apart from on stage where it was more of a rant. But Prince has sort of shown time and time and again through Lovesexy and other projects that he does have high concept ideas that he doesn't necessarily explain clearly enough for people to really grasp what he's getting at there.
To me, he was the bad guy wearing slave, because I thought it was foolish. Now, I understand he was marketing himself as the victim. But somehow the guy who, as I said, he's the only slave who owned the plantation. He was not a victim. He was a guy who had sold millions and millions and millions of records through a record company that had indulged him with projects that were, in some cases, follies, and had stood by him. They had indulged him with the making of movies that arguably shouldn't have been made, i.e. Graffiti Bridge. And, had they profited from it? Of course, they're in a business. But, my God, it's like he wasn't a slave. His definition of slave was somebody who doesn't own his own masters. The fact is that from the beginning of time, master recordings are the equity in the recording industry. The record companies pay every cost that has to do with the making of those records. It's their reason for existing, is to sell the product. If they don't own the product, they can't exist. Now, I understand that's a dated business model, that business model is now obsolete. That's why there's downloading. That's why there's self-produced records. The digital age has changed all that. And I get it. And I don't even want to argue the morality of it. Maybe there should have been a rule years and years and years ago that said that after 10 years, the ownership of a master reverts to the artist. I could live with that. But having worked for labels, I understand that up until the digital age, you needed a label. It was the only way to saturate the marketplace and get your music to radio, to the media, to the public. An artist couldn't do that. And if you're going to have to use these people to do that for you and to distribute the product, to manufacture it professionally, distribute it to the record stores efficiently, then they have to get paid. And if they're going to survive as an industry, then they have to have some equity. And the only equity was their artist contracts and the masters. So the argument that every artist should own all of their masters in perpetuity doesn't make any sense. It just doesn't make mathematical sense. If you want that label to serve your needs, they have to get something in return. The negotiation with Warner's in '92 it played a role in me leaving Paisley Park, because clearly Prince and I disagreed on where Paisley Park, the label, was going. It wasn't so much how much I would have been thrilled for him to get whatever he could get. You know, he's my guy, I work for him, so I want him to have the biggest deal he can get, the most successful, profitable, lucrative, supportive deal he could get. My fear was the support part was eroding. I don't think he really cared about that, because he was incredibly frustrated with the Paisley. Everybody was frustrated with Paisley Park, the label.
Well, I think at first Prince did seem like he might have brought the goods. He had so many successful side projects, and there was that period where, you know, Prince was recording so many full albums that weren't even getting released, that were full of great material. He just had so much going on, it almost seemed like, you know, it was never going to run out. So you could understand Warner Brothers wanting to get in on this as well, and to sort of finance the label, to encourage more of these great selling projects to come out. There was one point where the Time Records were really challenging Prince's own records on the R&B charts for sort of chart status. As time went on, I think Warner Brothers realised what a dog Paisley Park was turning out to be, and they did try and keep him happy. They gave him a brand new office, they staffed it for him, but Prince never even entered this office space that they gave him, which kind of shows how disinterested Prince was in running it as a label. You know, Prince at that time was a musician, and he had ideas from a musicianly standpoint in sort of late 80s with Paisley Park. He wasn't really interested in running a record label at that point, or certainly not running one how they quote unquote should be run.
We were all frustrated, and justifiably so. But what I kept pointing out to Prince was, this is a joint venture. We do have a responsibility to try to satisfy the other part of the joint, in this case, Warner's. And in his mind, that was kind of like, oh, you're for them now. And I'm saying, no, it's not adversarial. It shouldn't be. I realize that it is on a practical level sometimes, because we may say this record should get promotion, and they may say it doesn't deserve it. That's adversarial. But as a company, as a mentality, as a business model, you can't approach it as adversary, because they're your partners. And inescapably, they're your partners. So if we're going to go forward, we kind of have to hold hands and figure out a way to work together. And I know that sounds very simplistic, but it's the truth. It's just the fundamental truth. And, you know, as an artist, he didn't really want to hear that. And I understood that about him. So it was kind of like, you know what? This isn't going anywhere. This label is not going to work, because you're not going to give it the kind of product that they want from it. They are inescapably our partner in this. And we've got, it just became abundantly clear that we had entirely different concepts of what the business model for Paisley Park Records should be. And as a result, the joint venture was doomed to fail. So what's the roadkill going to be, and how is that going to affect Prince and his future? Because at the end of the day, I wasn't with them, I was with him. And so I was concerned about how that was going to play out and how it was going to affect him. And because of the renegotiation of his own contract, those concerns for Paisley Park Records kind of got pushed to the rear burner.
The changes that were happening at Warner Brothers in the early 90s and came to a head in the mid-90s, it was a power struggle at the top. Warner Brothers had been the ultimate boutique label for a couple of decades, since the late 60s, early 70s, under the regime of President Mo Austin, who was an older, I think he was an accountant, actually, originally for Frank Sinatra in the 50s. But Mo turned out to be possibly the most amazing and best and most effective, if not necessarily the most successful, record label president in history. Warner Brothers had a whole culture that was very artist-friendly, and they just had hit after hit after hit after hit. You know, I mean, Fleetwood Mac's Fleetwood Mac's Rumors was at the time the biggest selling record in history. The Eagles' Greatest Hits was also a Warner release. That was the biggest selling release in history. But owing mostly to egos, I would say, a power struggle was taking place at Warner Brothers, where the three labels were Warner Brothers, Elektra, and Atlantic, and ultimately over the next couple of years, the top executive of Atlantic got promoted over Mo Austin, and Mo was not accepting of that. So this played out with, costing the label millions and millions and millions of dollars over the next 3 years or so. And I would say it's never really recovered from it. And it's very sad because they had the most successful record company in the world, and they basically destroyed it.
It's interesting to note that when Warner Brothers started releasing Prince material after Prince had left the label, there tends to be a bit of a correlation between when Prince has got his own project coming out and when Warner Brothers released their project. So when Prince released Emancipation under the Symbol name, Warner Brothers released Chaos and Disorder, a sort of, album from the vaults that Prince had left them, kind of under the Prince name to try and challenge the Symbol brand. Later on, when Prince released Raven to the Joy Fantastic, Warner Brothers released the Vault Old Friends for Sale album, another compilation from the vaults, sort of try and challenge what Prince is doing. And you can also see that with Best Of. So in '93 they released the first Best Of, and it gets a load of rave reviews. Everyone talks about, I think one quote was how this isn't just a world of pop, this is a whole entire galaxy of pop. It consolidates Prince's career, shows all the great things he's done, and it draws attention away from the new stuff that he's trying to promote, new stuff he's trying to put out. Again, they do it in 2006 with Ultimate Prince came out at the same time as Prince had 3121 album coming out on Universal. So you could sort of see Warner Brothers kind of, if Prince is doing something, they're trying to do something to maybe distract or at least sort of, ride the coattails of whatever Prince is doing.